Sandra Siegel was a struggling single mom when she met Mike Barajas.
He caught her eye, and one thing led to another. They ended up getting married.
Together, they built a comfortable life for Sandra's 2 daughters.
He raised them. He gave them everything that they needed.
Even if it meant letting them move back in as adults.
I don't think there was more than a year when they had the house to themselves.
They seemed to be happy, just like any typical American family.
But after almost 30 years together, Sandra and Mike's marriage would come to a tragic end.
All I can tell you is that we have an unknown deceased victim in the house.
Was Mike the victim of a violent crime spree?
Colorado Springs was having a rash of home invasions and burglaries.
Or was it, as his brothers suspected, an inside job?
I said the only enemies he has is his stepdaughter and her friends.
But was that tension toxic enough to end in murder?
I don't have nothing to hide.
Or would the confession of an admitted criminal break the case wide open?
I told you I'd take his ass out.
He was worth more dead than he was alive.
And expose the one person no one suspected.
She was not a person of interest.
That was the love of your life at one time. It's just unimaginable.
Colorado Springs, Colorado, February 13th, 2013. It was the day before Valentine's Day in the city of 400,000 at the foot of the Rockies' spectacular Front Range.
It's a beautiful area. It's not utopia, but it's always been very pleasant and very calm and very quiet.
But at around 7 o'clock that Wednesday evening, Colorado Springs 911 received a worried call from one of the city's sprawling suburbs.
Aren't back doors open and the front room is all messed up?
The call came in as a burglary in progress.
The caller was 33-year-old Dawn Richburg.
Do you think that someone broke into your house? It does look like it.
Even more worrying, her stepfather, 47-year-old Miguel Mike Barajas, was supposed to be home.
I'm yelling, Daddy, and I'm not getting no response.
She says she saw a light on over by their mom and dad's bedroom. So she started walking towards there, and she stopped when she saw all of the bedding, sheets, everything pushed off onto the floor.
For all their sheets to be pulled off the bed like that, that's not normal.
She said she stopped, she got scared, and called us.
While sheriff's deputies converged on the scene, the dispatcher ordered Dawn out of the house for her own safety.
We're not sure if somebody's in the house or not.
And when the deputies arrived a few minutes later, they rushed into the house, guns drawn.
Anytime we're clearing a house, we have our weapons out.
What they found inside suggested a break-in.
There was stuff thrown all over the place and gone through.
But the ransacked rooms weren't all the officers found.
One of the first things they noticed was the spray painting in the house.
It looked to us like it was gang graffiti.
And when they looked inside the master bedroom, they found it exactly as Dawn described.
Blankets were all over the floor, and everything looked in disarray.
I yelled for Mr. Baraja, and I didn't receive a response. I took a closer look, and I saw a boot and a pant leg sticking out of the bedding.
It was Mike, and he was dead.
He was cold to the touch. He appeared to have been deceased for a while.
And when Sandra Barajas, Mike's wife of almost 30 years, rushed to the scene moments later, the news would send the 52-year-old widow collapsing into tears.
All I can tell you is that we have an unknown deceased victim in the house.
Oh my God! Mommy!
Born in 1960, Sandra Siegel spent her early years in El Paso, Texas, where she grew up to be a brash and outspoken teen.
She was very blunt, and she just said what came to her mind.
Her direct nature and occasionally bitter tongue didn't deter the boys, though. Sandra dated steadily through high school, got married soon after graduation, and gave birth to her daughter Dawn in 1979.
She was a happy-going girl. She liked to play.
A few years later, Sandra gave birth to a second daughter, but her marriage ended in divorce soon after.
He moved back with his family, and she kept the 2 girls.
And by her mid-20s, Sandra was still in El Paso, raising 2 children alone and barely making ends meet.
She had a job at a local, like a convenience store, gas station.
It was just a job to pay the bills, but it would end up changing the struggling single mom's life for the better, because that El Paso convenience store was where she met Mike Barajas. Born in 1965, Miguel Mike Barajas was the oldest of 4 brothers in a military family.
We traveled all over. We moved a lot. It seems like every 3 years. And that just kind of brought us all close together.
Being the oldest brother, he was left to babysit us a lot, so he never let us step out or, get out of control.
He was firm, but he was fair. He always watched out for us everywhere we went.
After graduating high school in 1983, he followed in his father's footsteps and joined the Army.
Once he graduated basic training, he was stationed down in Fort Bliss, Texas.
It was while living off base at Fort Bliss that he first met Sandra.
Every morning, he would stop at a gas station to fill up his car or to get a drink or something, and she worked there at the gas station, so that's kind of where they met.
I guess he caught her eye and she caught his, and they started talking and started going out, dating, and obviously one thing led to another.
And roughly a year after Sandra and Mike met, they were married.
We didn't make his actual wedding. All of us came down afterwards to visit him and meet her, and he was happy. I mean, he moved off post with her, and they got an apartment at first.
That wasn't the only big change for Mike either. At only 21, he was suddenly stepfather to Sandy's 2 girls, both under the age of 6.
He loved the girls loved him.
He raised them. He gave them everything that they needed.
And so that he could spend more time with his new family, Mike left the military in 1987 when his 4-year enlistment was up and took a 9-to-5 job as a security guard.
He was always the breadwinner. Sandy had odd jobs at different convenience stores and places like that.
It wasn't enough for luxuries, but over the next 10 years, Sandra and Mike built a life together.
He had a good life down there. He had everything he wanted. He had a wife, he had kids, he had good friends, he had, the only thing he was missing was Colorado and his family.
Because while Mike and Sandra were in El Paso, his brothers had all settled around Colorado Springs, where their father had spent many years while stationed at Fort Carson.
Mike would bring them up to the holidays, Christmas, Thanksgiving, every year.
We'd go down at least once every couple of years to visit Mike and Sandy and the kids, just to go down to visit them, go over to Mexico, do some shopping, eating some food.
But Mike had always longed to be reunited with his brothers. And in 1996, after more than a decade in El Paso, his brother Greg gave him the chance to do just that.
I got him a job where we worked at the car dealership. I told him, if you want the job, they want you here Monday.
Mike, who was used to sudden moves, didn't hesitate for a minute.
Mike came up, and he left the girls down there so they can pack up and get the house ready for sale. And then we all went down and got the girls and Sandy, and we moved them all up here. And when they came up, Mike was thrilled. Sandy wasn't so thrilled because she moved away from her mom and her sisters. The girls, teenagers, they were mumbling and grumbling because they wanted to go back home, back to where they knew.
But after a few months, Sandra and the girls settled into life in Colorado Springs, which, thanks to the money Mike was making at his new job, was a step up from their old life in El Paso.
Mike was a very hard worker. He went to work every day like clockwork, came home every day like clockwork.
Everything seemed to be really good. They seemed to be happy, just like any typical American family.
Mike, happy to be reunited with his extended family, became very active in their church.
Mike was real involved. He was an usher, so he did Mass on Saturday night. Sunday mornings, they had breakfast after Mass down at the Knights of Columbus Hall. He would go down there and meet the guys, and, it was kind of his social hour. He would hang out, talk.
And while Sandra often went to Mass with her devout husband, She enjoyed more secular socializing.
Sandy would go up to Cripple Creek, which is a gambling community. You go up there, it's like a little miniature Las Vegas.
Their interests sometimes differed, but by 2013, after almost 30 years together, they still seemed devoted to one another.
They would spend the evenings out on the porch. They were good. They were a happy couple.
However, while Sandra's daughters were both grown by then, she and Mike weren't exactly empty nesters. 33-year-old Dawn, the oldest, was on the rebound, living at home after a series of failed relationships.
Dawn was in another state for a while, but they would come back and live for a while.
And Sandra's youngest daughter was living at home, too.
I don't think out of the 15 years we lived across the street that there was more than a year when they had the house to themselves.
Their mother and Mike were more than happy to help out, though.
He was very, very generous to the girls.
Everything was good. They seemed like they got along really well.
But the day before Valentine's Day, someone would break into the family's home and leave their happy life shattered. Coming up, evidence at the scene suggests a gang-related crime spree.
Colorado Springs was having a rash of home invasions and burglaries.
But investigators discovered there was some trouble at home.
Mike was saying that he was getting frustrated.
On the night of February 13, 2013, sheriff's deputies responding to a reported break-in found Sandra Barajas' husband Mike dead in their Colorado Springs, Colorado home.
He was shot more than one time with a handgun.
The shooting appeared to be the result of a burglary gone bad.
The window in the downstairs bathroom area appeared to have been broken from the outside in.
Those weren't the only things that suggested a robbery either.
Colorado Springs was having a rash of home invasions and burglaries.
And this time, the intruders may have left a calling card behind.
There was suspicious graffiti and markings within the residence.
The graffiti says something to the effect of, "You got jacked, fool," and WS13. 13 usually stands for a Hispanic gang.
Hoping for a little more information, the investigators turned to the person who'd placed the 911 call, Mike's stepdaughter, Dawn Richburg.
Dawn Richburg was the adult daughter of Sandra Barajas, who was living at the Barajas residence.
The 33-year-old told the investigator that she and her mother had taken her younger sister to the hospital earlier that day, and that she'd returned home just minutes before dialing 911.
Dawn was dropped off at the residence earlier in that evening by her mother. Once in there, she starts saying, "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy," calling for her father to let him know she was home. She gets no answer, starts getting a feeling, she tells me, that something's not right. He usually always answers when we call his name. So she looks down the hallway to her parents' bedroom, and everything looked in disarray. That's when she gets nervous, calls 911, and backs out of the house until the police arrive.
Dawn's story matched the account she'd given the 911 operator and the evidence at the scene, but there was something troubling about it.
Her demeanor to me was very flat, non-emotional.
It struck me as very odd how flat she was.
Was Mike's stepdaughter, whom he'd raised since the age of 6, simply in shock? For the moment, all the investigators knew for certain was that when Dawn's mother, 52-year-old Sandra Barajas, rushed to the scene after receiving notification of her husband's death, she completely broke down.
How do I get in my house? We don't know, honey. We can't do anything until we start processing everything, okay?
Oh my God.
She was highly emotional, and as far as outward appearances, she appeared what you expect somebody who had lost a loved one.
I want to say mine.
Okay, listen. Listen.
I have to say mine. We just had our 27th anniversary. You just don't understand.
I understand.
Unfortunately, she had little to offer the investigators in the way of leads.
Do you have any enemies?
Nobody. Mikey helped everybody.
But when Greg Barajas and his brother Chris rushed to the scene after receiving word of Mike's death, they did have something for the investigators. Chris told them he'd called Mike at around 6 o'clock that evening, barely an hour before Dawn dialed 911.
I called his house phone. He still had a house phone. And voice answered it.
A voice that wasn't Mike's.
I'm like, where's Mike at? And the guy that on the other end of the phone, he says, he must be in the shower. And I said, well, just tell him his brother Chris called.
Chris said he hadn't thought much of it at the time.
I didn't ask who he was because Dawn had guys hang around the house.
But the brothers said they'd become suspicious when they arrived at the scene and spotted a man they'd never seen before among the crowd of neighbors gawking from outside the police tape.
He just stuck out like a sore thumb, out there without a jacket.
It's February. It's probably low 30, 30 degrees. And he's got cargo shorts on and a t-shirt.
And then, moments before the brothers spoke to the investigators, the stranger had done something else that made them suspicious.
That guy walks up and asks, will you give me a ride? I go, give you a ride where? I said, who are you? And he goes, well, I'm the girl's friend.
Was he the same man Chris had spoken to on the phone? Neither of Mike's brothers knew for sure, but they thought the fact that the mystery man claimed to know Sandra's daughters could be significant.
Detective Otto, he started asking me, he goes, did your brother, did he have any enemies? I said, the only enemies he has is his stepdaughter and her friends.
According to what his brothers told the investigator, the trouble between Mike and Dawn had started when she was in her teens.
She started having problems in school, and Dawn would get in trouble, and Mike would try to discipline her.
But it had little to no impact. After Dawn barely graduated, she left home and spent the next decade drifting from place to place and from one bad decision to the next.
She was always chasing after men, and she started doing drugs.
But a few months before her stepfather's murder, Dawn had ended up back home.
She was living with the guy up on the north side of Springs, and he died of a drug overdose.
The brothers said that Mike had been willing to take his stepdaughter in at first, but as the weeks and then months went by and she showed no intention of moving out, the old tensions resurfaced.
Mike was saying that he was getting frustrated, so I think it was starting to cause a lot of issues between the two of them.
And now, since a strange man who claimed to be Dawn's friend had been hanging around the crime scene, the investigators couldn't help but wonder, did the friction between Mike and his stepdaughter have something to do with his death?
I felt that something wasn't right here.
So that night, the investigators asked Dawn to come down to the sheriff's office for a formal statement, without indicating that they considered her a person of interest.
Dawn, I am sorry for your loss tonight. I know it's tough.
Dawn replied by claiming to have a good relationship with her stepfather.
We have good. We don't talk every single day, or I don't like hug him every single day, but we joke around a lot.
It was precisely the opening the investigators had been waiting for.
Be a little bit different story.
Put on the spot, Dawn insisted that her relationship with Mike had been good.
He even told me he'd help me buy me a car. So I didn't see no problems between us.
However, she did admit to having problems with drugs.
Have you ever been arrested before?
Yes.
Okay, for what?
Heroin.
But she insisted that she didn't know anything about her stepfather's murder.
I don't have nothing to hide. I didn't do nothing.
The investigators weren't sure they believed that.
Her demeanor led the detectives to the belief that there was more information that she knew.
But they had to let her go.
But it wasn't enough to be able to charge anybody.
However, they did give her a stern warning.
I really hope you think that if you were involved in this, that you would be wise enough to tell me your story before somebody else did.
Yeah.
And I can tell you this, These cases, we will solve it. It's just a matter of time.
Coming up, the investigators track down the mystery man from the crime scene.
He was a top suspect in a series of unsolved break-ins.
But his arrest leads to a surprising twist.
Let me talk to your mom.
By Valentine's Day 2013, it had been less than 24 hours since Sandra Barajas' husband Mike was found murdered in the couple's Colorado Springs home.
There was a great level of fear because our neighborhood is a very quiet neighborhood. We have a lot of retirees. We've never really had any issues in our neighborhood. And then for that to happen, it's just quite a shock.
We just didn't know how that had happened or who had done it or anything. And it was a stark reality that it can happen anywhere.
But while the family's neighbors remained in the dark, the investigators were beginning to suspect that Sandra's daughter, 33-year-old Dawn Richburg, knew more about the crime than she was telling the police.
We've determined that Dawn had a substance abuse problem.
Right away, I suspected the daughter's friends robbed the house, and maybe it was a robbery gone bad. Mike walked in on them.
And then there was the mystery man Mike's brothers had spotted hanging around the house after the shooting. Was he the killer? The police couldn't rule out the possibility.
Investigators take intense interest in who this man might be.
And since the mystery man had been asking for a ride, the investigators took a long shot.
We contacted the local taxi cab company and tried to determine if there had been any pickups in the area on the night of the homicide.
The result was an incredible break.
There had been a request for a taxi cab to pick an individual up at a location that was basically just outside the police cordon around the residence.
And if that wasn't lucky enough, when the investigators tracked down the cell phone used to call the cab, they came up with a name: 34-year-old Tommy Wright.
Tommy was definitely an individual that was someone the police wanted to talk to.
And while investigators set out to find him, they brought in Sandra to see if Tommy had any connection to her husband.
Have you ever heard the name Tommy?
I heard the name.
Mentioned by your daughters?
I heard the name, but I don't know who he is.
Though Sandra said she thought Tommy had been to the Barajas house.
He's only come over the house once, and that was in December.
Yeah, I mean, unless he's been there, when we weren't there, but I only remember him coming over one time.
The info made Tommy the top suspect in Mike's murder, but it took almost a week until February 20th for the investigators to track down Tommy Wright.
We were contacted by the Springfield Police Department in the very southeast corner of the state of Colorado.
They'd just picked up Tommy for an unrelated crime.
Tommy Wright was arrested on car theft charges, aggravated motor vehicle theft charges.
As soon as they got word that he was in custody, the Colorado Springs detectives made the 3-hour drive to Springfield. But they didn't find Tommy in a cooperative mood.
He didn't want to talk to us when he was arrested in Springfield.
Would they even need him to talk, though? After their trip to Springfield, the investigators returned to Colorado Springs and got a warrant to search Tommy's car and the apartment where he'd been staying.
Sergeant Otto, during his search of the vehicle and the apartment, recovered a .45 caliber handgun.
The gun was sent to the crime lab to determine if it was the murder weapon.
They compare the bullets that were recovered from Mike's body to the firearm.
But if the bullets matched, would it be case closed? Or would a shocking new development take the investigation in a surprising direction? By May 17, 2013, it had been 3 months since her husband's murder, and Sandra Barajas and her daughters were struggling to move on without Mike.
She said that they were hoping to move to another state where there was some family and some support, and that they were just hoping to start over.
And it seemed that Sandra might soon have some official closure, too, once the ballistics came back on the gun found in Tommy Wright's car.
We did have the murder weapon.
And on May 17th, during the grand jury hearing to formally indict Tommy Wright for Mike's murder, the authorities received an unexpected break.
sitting next to DA Reggie Short, getting a text message from one of my cohorts saying that Tommy Wright is willing to tell everything.
Hoping for a confession, the prosecutors arranged to put the grand jury hearing on hold while the investigators once again sat down with Tommy.
He completely acknowledged that he had been the one who fired the fatal shot.
He took 2 steps forward to the bed. That's when I stood up and shot him.
But just when the investigators figured they had everything they needed to convict Tommy of murder, his confession took an unexpected turn.
Tommy reveals that this wasn't a break-in after all. It was a murder plot.
And the real shock was who Tommy claimed was behind it.
He had done it in concert with, or specifically at the request of Sandra Barajas.
Tommy's claim caught the investigators completely by surprise.
Quite frankly, Sandra Barajas was not a person of interest, and over the course of several opportunities to speak with her, she certainly appeared to be distraught over the loss of her husband.
But according to Tommy, it was all an act. Tommy told the investigators that he'd met Sandra through her daughters.
Tommy told me that he met Dawn and her sister at a local convenience store in Colorado Springs. They met, started talking, some flirting. He goes with Dawn, her sister, to the residence. He spends some time there. They party, do drugs, things like that.
And according to Tommy, once Dawn brought him home, Sandy had approached him with an offer.
Sandy tells Tommy Wright she wants her husband dead.
They're supposed to give me the truck. They offered me $5,000 in cash.
However, according to Tommy, it wasn't just the $5,000 Sandy offered that sealed the deal. It was something else.
Sandra had told Tommy that Mike had been behaving inappropriately with Dawn's sister in a sexual manner.
This infuriated Tommy, and he felt he was going to step up and do the right thing if he would kill Mike Barajas.
Tommy told me that they talked about the plan to kill Mike, and they agreed. They came up with a plan, down to details.
They're going to stage a burglary. They're going to use spray paint to write messages on the wall and suggest that it's gang members who broke into the house.
Tommy said that once the plans were set, Sandra and Dawn took Dawn's sister to the hospital so that Sandra would have an alibi.
They left the residence, leaving Tommy Wright behind.
I started painting right as they were leaving.
And then, after taking the .45 from Mike's gun cabinet, Tommy had laid an ambush.
He describes positioning himself inside the bedroom with the lights turned off.
And at around 6 o'clock, Mike came into the house.
He described the moment that Mike walked into his bedroom. Tommy said he was crouched at Mike's bed, holding a .45 caliber pistol.
After Mikkel is dead, what all do you do? I just look at the showcase.
But then, while waiting for Sandra to pick him up when she dropped off Dawn to find her stepfather's body, the plan had gone awry.
The phone rang, and he answered the phone thinking it was them, and it was actually Chris.
That phone call screwed my whole day up.
Because according to Tommy, after he'd hung up on Mike's brother, he panicked and fled the house.
He hides in a drainage ditch, and at some point, he doubles back and returns to the house. He asks several people for a ride, and when he can't get one, he uses a cell phone to call a cab company.
The things that Tommy was telling me fit and were consistent with what we had found.
But would it be enough to pin the murder on Sandra and her daughter?
I proposed to Tommy that he place a phone call to Sandra to talk about what happened with Mike.
Minutes later, with the detectives listening in, Tommy made the call, but it was Sandra's daughter who answered.
Hey, Don.
Yeah.
What's up? It's Tommy.
Oh,
what's up?
It's clear from the first words of that phone call that Dawn is A, not thrilled to hear from Tommy, and B, very concerned that this person will be reaching out to her.
But Tommy pushed on, regardless.
Let me talk to your mom, because she kind of owes me big time. You guys all owe me big time.
Dawn didn't deny it. And when she put her mother on the phone, Tommy quickly got her to admit even more.
I told you I'd take his ass out, and I did I not? And if I'm saying that, that would be stupid of me to say if somebody listened.
I do have to give Tommy credit. He was very savvy on the phone.
I kept my word, and I killed Mike for you. Did I not?
Yeah.
Okay, so here's what I need from you.
He needs his money.
Money that, as it turned out, Sandra didn't have.
How much money will you be able to give me?
I can give you $500.
It was only a tenth of what he'd been promised, but the fact that Sandra agreed to pay Tommy anything was enough for the investigators.
Sandra agrees to meet Tommy at the Walmart location on the north end of town, where we have, obviously, units waiting for her.
As soon as she got into the area, she was stopped, contacted, and subsequently arrested.
And soon after Sandra's arrest, deputies went to her house and took her daughter Dawn into custody too.
When we heard about the arrest, we were surprised, but in some ways it was a relief to know that it wasn't some random attack.
Coming up, the trial reveals a possible motive.
You go up there and you can lose all your money in hours.
But is the prosecution's star witness worth the gamble?
We felt we had to make a deal with the devil.
On February 4th, 2014, Sandra Barajas went on trial for murder in the El Paso County Courthouse in Colorado Springs. The 53-year-old was accused of orchestrating the murder of her husband, Mike, who died in February of 2013, the victim of what initially appeared to be a home invasion robbery.
There was quite a bit of evidence that supported that idea.
But when the investigators caught up with Mike's killer, a petty thief named Tommy Wright, he told them that the so-called home invasion was just a cover for a murder plot cooked up by Sandra and her daughter, 34-year-old Dawn Richburg.
Tommy, Dawn, and Sandra were all arrested for Mike's murder.
But why would Sandra and her daughter want Mike dead? It certainly wasn't the reason they gave Tommy when they recruited him as Mike's killer.
We never found one piece of evidence, one statement that substantiated the claim that Mike had sexually abused Dawn's sister.
Instead, in his opening statement, the prosecutor claimed that Sandra's motive was far simpler.
She had a gambling problem.
According to the prosecutors and Mike's brothers, Sandra's gambling trips to Cripple Creek had crippled the family's finances.
You go up there and you can lose all your money in hours.
That was a family in severe financial distress, and it appeared to be a condition that was getting worse at every opportunity. The family was having difficulty making their bills.
He was starting to have problems with making the mortgage payment every month. But he was telling us my house is in foreclosure.
And the prosecutors theorized that by the beginning of 2013, things had gotten so bad that Mike finally decided to do something about it.
I believe he finally told her that he wanted a divorce.
And since Sandra didn't have a full-time job, the prosecution argued that Mike's decision had created a new crisis for Sandra and Dawn.
Sandy doesn't work. You could count on one hand how many times she's ever had a job in the whole time they were married. They couldn't survive without Mike.
At least not if he divorced Sandra. But if Mike died?
They knew Mike had life insurance.
It wasn't really a whole lot. I think all said and done, it was $150,000.
But according to the prosecution, that $150,000 was more than enough.
Anytime that you've got family in financial distress, that's always a motivation.
Sandra wanted to pay off the bills, to pay off the house, to pay off whatever bills she had, and then have money extra.
And that wasn't the only way that Sandra could cash in on her husband's death either.
They had an accidental death that they had through his work and then his retirement.
He was worth more to them dead than he was alive.
They figured they could live the rest of their life off of what they got off of him.
According to the prosecution, it was easy to convince Sandra's drug-addicted daughter to go along with the plan.
This was a murder plot that was hashed out while Don and Tommy Wright were using methamphetamine.
And they claimed that Sandra's offer of $5,000 just as easily convinced Tommy to be the trigger man.
Paying someone to kill someone that you married and was the love of your life at one time is just unimaginable.
It might have seemed unimaginable to most people, but the prosecutors had a powerful witness prepared to testify that it was true.
The district attorney's office had come to an agreement with Tommy Wright.
It was either nail him to the wall, because they definitely have the evidence, and send him to prison for life and let Sandy possibly walk, or make a deal with him and get Sandy.
We felt we had to make a deal with the devil.
And when he took the stand, Tommy did his best to look the part.
Tommy was entirely nonchalant about the description of killing somebody.
He had like a smirk on his face, like he enjoyed it.
And as he testified, the entire courtroom hung on his every word.
It was absolutely riveting to hear.
Or infuriating, depending on one's perspective.
I wanted to get up there and go beat him to a pulp is what I wanted to do.
Tommy had such an arrogance about himself.
In fact, Tommy's arrogance was so off-putting that the prosecutors worried that his testimony could backfire.
We were concerned it wouldn't be enough to get a first-degree murder conviction.
Luckily, they had the tapes to back up Tommy's story.
But I kept my word and I killed Mike for you, did I not?
We felt it was beyond a reasonable doubt that she should be convicted of first-degree murder.
However, despite the phone calls and the fact that she'd been arrested while trying to pay her husband's killer, the defense argued that Sandra was innocent.
She has steadfastly maintained that she was not responsible for Tommy Wright killing her husband.
She was somewhat in disbelief, almost like we were making these things up.
However, there were at least some parts of Tommy's testimony that the defense agreed with.
The suggestion from Sandra Barajas is that it was Tommy Wright and Dawn Ridgeberg who were responsible for the murder.
And according to the defense, Sandra wasn't involved at all. It was her daughter, Dawn, who'd recruited Tommy alone.
Sandy and her defense team basically turned the whole thing over against Dawn.
She had a problem with drugs, would do anything to get them, saw her stepfather, Mike, as someone who was in the way of her getting what she wanted.
And according to the defense, she didn't hesitate to get rid of her stepfather, the man that had raised her from the time she was 6 years old.
They describe her as a con artist, backstabber, very mean, hateful person. She would do anything to get to what she needs.
She was very manipulative. She was a liar. My belief is she is a cold-blooded person, too. Very, very capable of murder.
But if that were true, why was Sandra the one who'd been arrested paying for the hit? According to the defense, it was only because Dawn had pressured her mother into it.
They said Dawn was so manipulative, Dawn was so demanding, Dawn so mean, I'm terrified for my life. It's all we heard for a week and a half was Dawn, Dawn, Dawn.
Coming up, will the jurors believe a confessed killer?
Tommy would not be credible.
Or will they side with Sandra?
The longer it goes, typically it doesn't go in the prosecution's favor.
On Friday, February 21st, 2014, the jury announced a verdict in the murder trial of Sandra Barajas. The 53-year-old mother of two was charged with orchestrating the murder of her husband, Mike.
She's the one who, lack of a better word, was the brains of the operation. She was in it up to her eyeballs.
This was Sandra actively participating, actively seeking out someone to carry this out.
And the man who'd carried it out, 35-year-old Tommy Wright, had been the star witness for the prosecution.
Tommy testified, and it was tough. I mean, because you had to sit there, listen to all the gruesome details.
But would those gruesome details be enough for a conviction? Or would his conduct on the witness stand sway the jury in Sandra's favor?
He, at various points, seemed to break out into either a smirk or some sort of laughter.
She thought that she would get off, that she would be found not guilty, that Tommy would not be credible.
And when the jury finally filed back into the courtroom, Sandra may have had reason to feel confident.
The deliberation went 2.5 days, which started to worry me because I've always heard the longer the jury deliberates, typically it doesn't go in the prosecution's favor.
But would that be true this time?
Sandra was found guilty of first-degree murder.
She was very, very surprised when she was convicted. That shocked her.
Mike's brothers were just as overcome.
They were all very happy, broke down, started crying.
She was going to jail for life.
In Colorado, the sentence for first-degree murder is life without parole.
Sandra's conviction was enough to convince her daughter, Dawn Richburg, to cut a deal. The 34-year-old had also been charged with her stepfather's murder.
Dawn pled to second-degree murder.
She had just seen her mother be sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. I think that anybody would have to think twice about whether they wanted to go through that same process with that same potential outcome.
Since the trial, Mike's younger brother still struggled to deal with their loss.
I lay awake night thinking my brother died senselessly.
He was a good father, husband, just all the way around a good man.
But they take comfort in knowing that Sandra will ultimately pay the price for what she's done.
It's a peaceful thought to think she's going to take her last breath behind those walls.
Gerard John Schaefer entered the history of American crime not simply as a convicted murderer, but as a man whose identity made the allegations against him especially disturbing. He was a deputy sheriff, a person whose authority was supposed to represent protection, order, and the law. Yet in the summer of 1972, two teenage girls would tell investigators that the same man had used that authority to take control of them, drive them into an isolated wooded area, tie them to a tree, and place nooses around their necks. Their survival would become one of the most important threads in a case that eventually led to two first-degree murder convictions. But the story of Gerard John Schaefer is also a story about uncertainty. He was convicted of killing Susan Carroll Place and Georgia Marie Jessup. Those two murders were established in court. Beyond them, however, there was a much larger and far more difficult landscape of missing women. Unidentified photographs, personal belongings, disturbing writings, and claims that Schaefer himself was connected to other disappearances. Over the years, numbers such as 20 or 30 possible victims became associated with his name. But those numbers cannot simply be presented as established fact. Some cases were supported by objects found among Schaefer's possessions. Some involved suspicions from investigators. Some were connected to statements Schaefer made years later. And some never produced enough evidence to bring another murder charge against him. That distinction matters, because the history of a criminal case is not built only from suspicion. It is also built from what can be demonstrated. The proven part of Schaefer's story begins with two girls who survived. In July 1972, Nancy Trotter, 18, and Pamela Wells, 17, encountered Schaefer while he was working as a law enforcement officer. According to their testimony, Schaefer told them that hitchhiking was illegal and then offered to drive them. What might have appeared to be an encounter with a police officer quickly became something else. He took the girls to an isolated wooded area. There, according to their account, he tied them to a tree and placed nooses around their necks. The girls were forced to maintain a position that prevented the ropes from tightening around their throats. Then Schaefer received a call over the police radio and left the area. That interruption gave Nancy Trotter and Pamela Wells the opportunity they needed. They escaped and found their way to safety. They reported what had happened, and Schaefer was arrested and charged with aggravated assault and false imprisonment. He was released on bail. That detail would later become part of the larger chronology surrounding his case. Because only weeks after the encounter with Trotter and Wells, 2 other teenage girls disappeared. On September 27, 1972, Susan Carroll Place, 17, and Georgia Marie Jessup, 16, left Fort Lauderdale. Susan had told her mother, Lucille Place, that she and Georgia were going to the beach to play guitar with a man she knew as Jerry Shepard or Shepard. Lucille Place saw the man and the vehicle in which the girls left. She also recorded the vehicle's license plate number. At the time, there was no way to know how important that small act of observation would become. Susan and Georgia did not return. Their disappearance did not immediately become the kind of case that would eventually place Gerard Schaefer at the center of a murder investigation. In the early stages, missing teenagers could be viewed as runaways, and the absence of an immediate crime scene meant there was little physical evidence to explain what had happened. The 2 girls simply vanished from the lives of the people who knew them. Then, more than 6 months later, the case changed. On April 1st, 1973, human remains were discovered in the Port St. Lucie and Hutchinson Island area of Florida, near the area associated with Blind Creek. On April 5th, the remains were identified through dental records as those of Susan Place and Georgia Jessup. The discovery transformed the missing person investigation into a homicide investigation. The circumstances surrounding the remains suggested that the girls had been restrained and tied to a tree. Susan had suffered an injury consistent with having been shot in the jaw area. And investigators now had to look again at what Nancy Trotter and Pamela Wells had described months earlier. 2 teenage girls, an isolated area, restraint, a tree, nooses around the neck, and a law enforcement officer named Gerard John Schaefer. The connection was not, by itself, proof that every detail of one case explained the other. But it was impossible for investigators to ignore. Schaefer's own path into law enforcement made the situation even more difficult to understand. Born on March 25, 1946, in Wisconsin, he had attempted to enter police work before eventually becoming a deputy sheriff. His career path had not been straightforward. He had been rejected by the Broward County Sheriff's Office after failing a psychological examination. He later worked for approximately 6 months at the Wilton Manors Police Department before being dismissed. Despite those setbacks, he eventually joined the Martin County Sheriff's Office as a deputy sheriff in 1972. That meant that when Nancy Trotter and Pamela Wells encountered him, they were not confronting an unknown stranger in an unfamiliar setting. They were confronting someone who carried the authority of a police officer. That fact would remain one of the most unsettling elements of the entire case. The badge was supposed to signify protection. Instead, according to the surviving witnesses, it had become part of the mechanism through which they were controlled. After the discovery of Susan and Georgia, investigators began examining Schaefer more closely. He denied knowing the 2 missing girls, but the investigation did not end with his denial. On April 7, 1973, police searched the home of Schaefer's mother. What they found would widen the investigation dramatically. Among the possessions were a wallet identified as belonging to Susan Place, jewelry associated with Lee Bonadies, who had disappeared in 1969, items believed to be connected to Carmen Hollock, another woman who disappeared in 1969, the address book of Belinda Hutchins, and personal belongings associated with Colette Goodenough and Barbara Wilcox. There was also an item connected to Mary Alice Briscolina. Investigators found firearms, knives, photographs of unidentified women, and hundreds of pages of writings and drawings involving violence and murder. The collection did not establish a murder conviction in every case. It did something else first. It changed the scale of the investigation. What had begun with the disappearance and deaths of Susan Place and Georgia Jessup was now connected, at least as an investigative matter, to a much wider group of missing women and girls. Schaefer had explanations for the objects. He said he had purchased Susan's wallet in Morocco. He said some documents belonging to missing women had been found while he was on patrol. He said Lee Bonadies' jewelry had been given to him as a gift. He described his violent writings as thoughts he had written down following advice from a psychiatrist. In relation to material connected to Carmen Hallock, he even suggested that someone else could have placed the evidence among his possessions. Investigators did not accept those explanations as sufficient. On May 18, 1973, Schaefer was formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Susan Place and Georgia Jessup. From that point forward, the case would move toward a courtroom where suspicion would have to become evidence and where the surviving witnesses would have to tell their story. But even before the trial began, one fact had already become impossible to ignore. Nancy Trotter and Pamela Wells had survived an encounter that could have ended very differently. Their testimony had opened a door. Susan Place and Georgia Jessup would never walk through one again. And as investigators looked beyond those 2 names, they encountered a disturbing question that would remain long after Gerard John Schaefer was behind bars. How much of the darkness surrounding his name could actually be proven? In the summer of 1972, Gerard John Schaefer was still a relatively new deputy sheriff, but the authority represented by his uniform was already central to the events that would eventually define his name. The encounter with Nancy Trotter and Pamela Wells began with something that, on the surface, could have appeared ordinary: 2 young women and a police officer. Nancy was 18 years old. Pamela was 17. They encountered Schaefer while he was working, and according to their later testimony, he told them that hitchhiking was illegal. He then offered to drive them. That statement mattered because it placed the 2 girls in a situation where the person speaking to them was not simply another stranger on the road. He was a law enforcement officer. The warning about hitchhiking carried the authority of the badge. For Nancy and Pamela, there was reason to believe that the person standing before them had the power to decide whether they were breaking the law. The offer of a ride, therefore, came from someone who appeared to have legitimate authority over the situation. But according to the girls, the journey did not end where they expected. Schaefer drove them to an isolated wooded area. Away from the ordinary surroundings in which the encounter had begun, the balance of power changed. The officer who had presented himself as someone enforcing the law was now, according to the girls, the person controlling their movements. In that secluded area, Schaefer tied Nancy and Pamela to a tree. He placed nooses around their necks. The girls were forced to maintain their bodies in a position that prevented the ropes from tightening. The situation was therefore not simply one of being restrained. Their physical survival depended on maintaining a position that kept the nooses from becoming fatal. It was a form of control that turned the surrounding isolation into another barrier. There were no ordinary passers-by to whom they could immediately appeal, and there was no obvious reason to believe that help was close. The same authority that had brought them into the vehicle now appeared to have become part of the danger. Yet the encounter did not end in the woods. At some point, Schaefer received a call over his police radio. He left the area. For Nancy Trotter and Pamela Wells, that interruption created a narrow opportunity. They were still restrained, still in danger, but Schaefer was no longer there. They managed to escape. They found their way out of the isolated area and reported what had happened. Their decision to speak was crucial. Without their account, the events of that summer might never have become connected to the later investigation. Their testimony established not only that Schaefer had taken them to a secluded location, but also that they had survived an encounter involving restraint and nooses around their necks. The allegations were serious enough that Schaefer was arrested and charged with aggravated assault and false imprisonment. The charges placed the deputy sheriff on the opposite side of the law he had been sworn to enforce. But the legal consequences did not immediately remove him from the outside world. Schaefer was released on bail. That fact would become increasingly significant as investigators later reconstructed the sequence of events surrounding several young women who disappeared in Florida. At this stage, however, the case involving Nancy Trotter and Pamela Wells was its own investigation. The two girls were alive. They could describe what had happened to them. They could identify the man they said had restrained them. And their account provided something investigators would later struggle to obtain in other cases: the testimony of survivors. Their survival also meant that investigators had a direct description of Schaefer's alleged method of control. He had used the circumstances of a police encounter to gain compliance, driven the girls away from ordinary surroundings, and restrained them in an isolated location. None of this, by itself, established what would happen later, but it created a record of conduct that would become difficult to separate from the events that followed. Only weeks after Nancy Trotter and Pamela Wells escaped, two other teenage girls disappeared. Susan Carroll Place was 17. Georgia Marie Jessup was 16. On September 27, 1972, they left Fort Lauderdale. Susan had told her mother, Lucille Place, that she and Georgia were going to the beach to play guitar with a man she knew as Jerry Shepard or Shepard. Lucille Place saw the man and the vehicle the girls entered. She recorded the vehicle's license plate number. At the time, that detail may have seemed like nothing more than a mother remembering what she had seen. Later, it became an important piece of information. Susan and Georgia did not return. Their disappearance created a new mystery, one that initially lacked the physical evidence investigators would eventually need. There was no surviving witness who could describe what happened after the girls left. There was no immediate crime scene. There was simply the last known journey of two teenagers and the fact that they never came home. The timing would later become important. Schaefer had already been arrested following the allegations made by Trotter and Wells, but he had been released on bail. The case involving Susan and Georgia emerged while the earlier allegations were still part of the broader chronology surrounding him. For the families of the missing girls, however, chronology was not an abstract investigative tool. It was the painful reality of waiting. A person leaves. A family expects that person to return. The hours pass. Then the days. Then the uncertainty becomes its own kind of presence. Susan and Georgia remained missing for more than 6 months. During that period, the case did not yet have the certainty that would come later. The girls were missing, but investigators did not yet have the remains that would establish that they had been killed. That changed on April 1st, 1973. Human remains were discovered in the Port St. Lucie and Hutchinson Island area of Florida, near the area associated with Blind Creek. The discovery was the moment when the disappearance of two teenagers became something far more final. On April 5th, the remains were identified through dental records as Susan Place and Georgia Jessup. The identities transformed the investigation. Investigators now knew that the two girls had not simply run away and disappeared into another life. They were dead. The circumstances surrounding the remains also raised disturbing similarities with the earlier allegations involving Trotter and Wells. The girls were believed to have been restrained and tied to a tree. Susan had suffered an injury involving a gunshot to the jaw area. The evidence did not erase the uncertainty surrounding exactly what had happened to Susan and Georgia, but it provided investigators with a physical reality that could no longer be dismissed. Two girls who had left Fort Lauderdale in September were now dead, and the name of Gerard Schaefer was already present in the background because of the testimony of two girls who had survived a previous encounter with him. That connection became one of the most important investigative threads. The cases were not identical, and it would be wrong to treat every similarity as proof. But the sequence was troubling. Young women, an isolated location, restraint, and a man whose name had already been placed into an investigation involving two surviving victims. Lucille Place's recollection of the man and the vehicle became increasingly important as investigators attempted to reconstruct the final known movements of her daughter and Georgia. Schaefer denied knowing the two missing girls, but a denial could not resolve the questions raised by the evidence. Investigators continued examining his background and possessions. On April 7, 1973, police searched the home of Schaefer's mother. What they found there would expand the case far beyond Susan Place and Georgia Jessup. A wallet identified as Susan's was among the items. So were objects associated with other missing women. Jewelry connected to Lee Bonadies, who had disappeared in 1969. Items believed to be associated with Carmen Hollock, also missing since 1969. The address book of Belinda Hutchins. A passport, diary, and poetry books belonging to Colette Goodenough. A driver's license belonging to Barbara Wilcox. An item associated with Mary Alice Briscolina. The search also uncovered firearms, knives, photographs of unidentified women, and hundreds of pages of writings and drawings involving violence and murder. The investigation had now reached a dangerous turning point. The question was no longer limited to what had happened to Susan and Georgia. Investigators were confronted with a collection of objects that appeared, in different ways, to connect Schaefer to other missing women and girls. But even here, the distinction between suspicion and proof remained essential. Finding an object associated with a missing person could raise a serious question. It did not automatically provide a murder conviction. A disturbing drawing could reveal something about the person who created it, but it did not establish that every act depicted had actually occurred. A later confession could be significant, but without independent evidence, it could not simply be treated as a courtroom verdict. The investigation would have to separate these categories. Schaefer himself offered explanations for the possessions investigators had discovered. He said he had purchased Susan Place's wallet in Morocco. He said some documents belonging to missing women had been found while he was on patrol. He said Lee Bonadies' jewelry had been given to him as a gift. He described his violent writings as thoughts recorded following advice from a psychiatrist. In relation to evidence connected to Carmen Hollock, he suggested that someone else could have placed it among his belongings. Investigators did not accept these explanations as sufficient. On May 18, 1973, Schaefer was formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Susan Place and Georgia Jessup. The case that had begun with 2 girls surviving a terrifying encounter in the woods had now moved into the territory of homicide. Nancy Trotter and Pamela Wells had escaped. Susan Place and Georgia Jessup had not, and the difference between those outcomes would become central to everything that followed. The surviving girls could speak about what Schaefer had done to them. Susan and Georgia could not. Their story would have to be reconstructed from the evidence left behind, from witnesses who remembered their final movements, from the remains discovered months later, and from the objects found in a place connected to Schaefer. The investigation was becoming larger, but it was also becoming more difficult. Every new name created another question, and every new piece of evidence demanded another distinction between what investigators suspected and what a court could prove. Gerard John Schaefer was no longer simply the deputy accused by 2 surviving teenagers. He was now facing 2 first-degree murder charges, and the story of the women whose names had appeared around him was only beginning to unfold. On September 27, 1972, Susan Carroll Place was 17 years old. Georgia Marie Jessup was 16. They left Fort Lauderdale together, and at the time, there was no reason for the people around them to understand that this would be the last day they would be seen alive. Susan had told her mother, Lucille Place, that she and Georgia were going to the beach. They planned to play guitar with a man Susan knew as Jerry Shepard or Shepard. It was an ordinary enough explanation to leave behind, the kind of plan that might not have seemed unusual to a parent in the moment. But Lucille Place did something that would later become critically important. She saw the man the girls were going with. She also saw the vehicle, and she wrote down its license plate number. That small detail would remain in the investigation long after the two girls disappeared. Once Susan and Georgia left, they did not come home. There was no immediate explanation for their absence. No message arrived to explain where they were. No one could simply say what had happened after they departed Fort Lauderdale. The uncertainty was particularly difficult because the girls were teenagers. Their disappearance could be interpreted in different ways, and in the early stages, a missing teenager was not necessarily treated as the victim of a violent crime. The possibility of a runaway had to be considered. That meant that the first stage of the investigation was dominated by uncertainty rather than certainty. The families knew only that two girls had left and had not returned. Investigators had to work backward from the last information available to them. Susan had mentioned the beach. She had mentioned playing guitar. She had identified the man as Jerry Shepard or Shepard. Her mother had seen the man and the vehicle and recorded the license plate. Those details formed the beginning of a timeline, but they did not yet explain the end of it. Months passed without a definitive answer. The absence of the girls remained unresolved. Then, in the spring of 1973, the case changed completely. On April 1st, human remains were discovered in the Port St. Lucie and Hutchinson Island area of Florida, near the area associated with Blind Creek. The discovery introduced a possibility that investigators could no longer ignore. Susan and Georgia might not have disappeared voluntarily. The remains had to be identified. 4 days later, on April 5th, they were identified through dental records as those of Susan Place and Georgia Jessup. The identification transformed the investigation from a missing person case into a homicide investigation. The two girls had not simply vanished. They had died. And now investigators had to determine how, where, and by whom. The remains and the surrounding evidence suggested that the girls had been restrained and tied to a tree. Susan was recorded as having suffered an injury caused by a gunshot to the jaw area. The circumstances were therefore consistent with a violent death, not an unexplained disappearance. Yet the discovery of the remains created as many questions as it answered. When had the girls been killed? Where exactly had the killings taken place? Who had taken them to the area? And was the man Susan had identified as Jerry Shepard or Shepard connected to what had happened? Investigators already had a reason to look closely at Gerard John Schaefer. Only months earlier, two other young women, Nancy Trotter and Pamela Wells, had accused him of taking them to an isolated wooded area, tying them to a tree, and placing nooses around their necks. They had survived because Schaefer left the location after receiving a call over his police radio. Their testimony had led to his arrest and charges of aggravated assault and false imprisonment. He had been released on bail. Now, after the discovery of Susan and Georgia, investigators were forced to examine whether the earlier allegations and the new deaths might have some connection. The similarity was troubling. In the Trotter-Wells case, two teenage girls had been taken to an isolated area and restrained against a tree, with ropes placed around their necks. In the Place-Jessup case, two teenage girls had disappeared and were later found dead, with evidence suggesting restraint and that they had been tied to a tree. Similarities alone could not establish that the same person had committed both acts, but they created a question that investigators could not reasonably ignore. There was another important detail. The man Susan had named had a name that sounded similar to Gerard Schaefer. That did not prove that Jerry Shepard was Schaefer. Investigators still needed evidence connecting the two identities. Lucille Place's recollection became particularly significant because she had seen the man herself. She had also seen the vehicle in which Susan and Georgia left, and she had recorded its license plate. Her memory, therefore, offered investigators something more concrete than a general recollection. It gave them a detail that could be compared with information about Schaefer and his vehicle. As the investigation progressed, Schaefer denied knowing Susan and Georgia. His denial was important because it directly contradicted the possibility that he was the man Susan had described. But investigators did not stop with his statement. The remains had been found. The identities had been established. The circumstances of death were violent. And there was already an earlier case involving Schaefer and 2 surviving teenagers. The next step was to examine what else could connect him to Susan and Georgia. That investigation led police to the home of Schaefer's mother. On April 7, 1973, officers conducted a search. What they discovered would transform the case once again. Among the items found was a wallet identified as belonging to Susan Place. The presence of Susan's wallet was significant because it directly connected a personal possession of one of the dead girls to property associated with Schaefer. But investigators found more than Susan's belongings. They discovered jewelry associated with Lee Bonadies, a 25-year-old woman who had disappeared in 1969. They found items believed to be connected to Carmen Hallock, another woman who had disappeared that same year. Among the possessions was an address book belonging to Belinda Hutchins, who had disappeared in 1972. Investigators also found a passport, diary, and poetry books associated with Colette Goodenough. A driver's license belonging to Barbara Wilcox was among the items. Another piece of jewelry was associated with Mary Alice Briscolina. These discoveries expanded the investigation far beyond the deaths of Susan Place and Georgia Jessup. They suggested that investigators might be looking at someone connected to a larger collection of missing person cases. But this was also the point at which the distinction between evidence and suspicion became essential. The presence of a missing person's belongings in Schaefer's possession could raise serious questions. It could lead investigators to examine an old disappearance again. It could place Schaefer under intense suspicion. But it did not automatically establish that Schaefer had killed every person whose belongings were found. Some of those women had disappeared years earlier. Some had remains discovered later. Some cases never resulted in murder charges against Schaefer. The investigation, therefore, had to move carefully between what could be connected and what could be proven. The search also uncovered firearms and knives, photographs of women whose identities were not immediately known, and hundreds of pages of writings and drawings involving violence and murder. These materials were disturbing, but they presented another evidentiary problem. Violent writings could reveal disturbing thoughts. Drawings could depict violent acts. But they could not, on their own, establish that every act described had actually occurred. Investigators nevertheless began to view Schaefer as a possible serial murder suspect. The question had changed. It was no longer simply, what happened to Susan Place and Georgia Jessup? It had become, what else might be connected to this man? Schaefer responded to the discoveries with explanations. He said the wallet belonging to Susan Place had been purchased in Morocco. He said some documents connected to missing women had been found while he was on patrol. He said Lee Bonadies' jewelry had been given to him as a gift. He explained the violent writings by saying that they were thoughts he had written down following advice from a psychiatrist. Regarding evidence connected to Carmen Hallock, he suggested that someone else might have placed the items among his possessions. Investigators did not accept these explanations as sufficient. The collection of objects, the circumstances surrounding Susan and Georgia, and the testimony from Nancy Trotter and Pamela Wells created a growing body of suspicion. On May 18, 1973, Gerard John Schaefer was formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Susan Place and Georgia Jessup. The charges established the legal focus of the case. Whatever questions surrounded the other missing women, the prosecution now had 2 specific victims. Susan was 17. Georgia was 16. They had left Fort Lauderdale together on September 27, 1972. They had gone with a man Susan knew as Jerry Shepard or Shepard. They never returned. 6 months later, their remains were found. Their identities were established through dental records. And now a deputy sheriff stood accused of their murders. For the families of Susan and Georgia, the investigation had finally moved beyond uncertainty. But it was not an ending. It was the beginning of a courtroom battle in which prosecutors would have to establish what had happened to two girls who could no longer tell their own story. The evidence would have to speak for them. The surviving witnesses would have to speak for them. And the court would have to decide whether the collection of circumstances surrounding Gerard John Schaefer was enough to prove, beyond the standards required by law, that he was responsible for their deaths. By the time investigators searched the home of Gerard John Schaefer's mother on April 7, 1973, the case had already moved far beyond the disappearance of Susan Place and Georgia Jessup. The discovery of their remains had established that the two teenagers were dead. Their identities had been confirmed through dental records on April 5th. Evidence suggested that they had been restrained and tied to a tree, and Susan had suffered an injury involving a gunshot to the jaw area. At the same time, investigators had another piece of information that could not be ignored. Only months earlier, Nancy Trotter and Pamela Wells had accused Schaefer of taking them to an isolated wooded area, tying them to a tree, and placing nooses around their necks. The earlier case had already placed Schaefer under suspicion. The deaths of Susan and Georgia now made his connection to the missing girls a matter of much greater urgency. The search on April 7th would become one of the most consequential steps in the investigation. Investigators were no longer looking only for something that might connect Schaefer to Susan and Georgia. They were also looking for indications of whether his relationship with missing women extended beyond those two victims. What they found created a disturbing collection of objects, each carrying its own question. Among the items was a wallet identified as belonging to Susan Place. This was one of the most direct pieces of the search. Susan had disappeared on September 27, 1972. Her remains had been discovered months later. Now an item identified as hers was found among property associated with Schaefer. The wallet did not, by itself, explain exactly what had happened to Susan, but it provided investigators with a tangible connection between the dead teenager and the man, already facing scrutiny. Then there were the belongings associated with other missing women. Investigators found jewelry connected to Lee Bonadies, who had disappeared in 1969. They also found items believed to be associated with Carmen Hollock, who had disappeared that same year. The appearance of these objects changed the scope of the investigation. Susan and Georgia were no longer the only names being examined in connection with Schaefer. The investigators were now looking backward through years of unresolved disappearances. Another item found during the search was the address book of Belinda Hutchins, who had disappeared in 1972. Investigators also found a passport, diary, and books of poetry belonging to Colette Goodenough. A driver's license belonging to Barbara Wilcox was among the possessions. Another piece of jewelry was associated with Mary Alice Briscolina. Each object represented a different person, a different disappearance, and a different unanswered question. None of those questions could automatically be answered simply because an item had been found. That distinction would become increasingly important as the investigation expanded. There is a temptation in cases involving suspected serial offenders to assemble every suspicious detail into one uninterrupted narrative. But criminal investigations do not work that way. A personal possession can be powerful evidence of association without necessarily proving how it came into someone's hands. A missing person's belongings can justify reopening an investigation without proving who caused the disappearance. And an investigator's suspicion, however strong, is not the same thing as a conviction. The Schaefer investigation would eventually become a striking example of that difference. The search also uncovered firearms and knives. Investigators found photographs of women whose identities were not immediately known. More disturbing still were hundreds of pages of writings and drawings involving violence and murder. These materials gave investigators another reason to scrutinize Schaefer. They appeared to reveal a preoccupation with violent and sexualized acts, including material concerning torture and murder. But even here, the evidence had to be interpreted carefully. A drawing or written fantasy is not the same thing as a documented crime. A disturbing thought does not establish that the person who wrote it carried out the act described. The material could deepen investigators' concern about Schaefer, but it could not automatically turn every imagined act into a proven homicide. Nevertheless, the cumulative effect was significant. Investigators were now confronted with a deputy sheriff whose possessions appeared to include personal items connected to several missing women, along with weapons, photographs, and extensive writings about violence. The investigation was no longer centered on one isolated event. It had become an attempt to determine whether there was a broader pattern. Schaefer, however, did not simply accept the accusations. He offered explanations for the objects investigators had discovered. Regarding Susan Place's wallet, he said he had purchased it in Morocco. The explanation offered investigators a possible reason for possessing the wallet without directly connecting him to Susan's death. Regarding documents belonging to missing women, Schaefer said that some had been found while he was on patrol. Again, the explanation attempted to place the objects within his work as a law enforcement officer rather than within a pattern of criminal activity. He said the jewelry associated with Lee Bonadies had been given to him as a gift. For the violent writings, he said there were thoughts he had written down following the advice of a psychiatrist. And concerning material associated with Carmen Hollock, he suggested that someone else might have placed the items in his room. These explanations did not resolve the investigators' concerns. The presence of Susan's wallet remained significant. The other possessions continued to raise questions, and the earlier testimony of Nancy Trotter and Pamela Wells provided an independent account of Schaefer allegedly using a remote location and physical restraints against young women. The investigation, therefore, began to move in two directions at once. One direction focused on the specific evidence connecting Schaefer to Susan Place and Georgia Jessup. The other looked outward, toward the growing number of missing person cases that investigators believed might possibly be connected to him. This was where the distinction between suspect and convicted murderer became especially important. Schaefer could be suspected in several cases without being prosecuted for them. He could possess an item associated with a missing woman without a court ever determining exactly how he obtained it. And even if investigators believed that several disappearances formed a pattern, the legal system still required evidence sufficient to support specific criminal charges. The investigation into Lee Bonadies illustrates that problem. Bonadies, 25, had disappeared in Fort Lauderdale in 1969. Jewelry associated with her was found among Schaefer's possessions. Her remains were later discovered. Those facts were deeply troubling, but Schaefer was never convicted of killing her. The same basic caution applied to Carmen Marie Hollock, who was 22 when she disappeared in 1969. Investigators found material believed to be connected to Hollock, including a tooth identified by her dentist. Yet Schaefer was not convicted of her murder either. The same pattern would eventually appear in other cases associated with his name. Mary Alice Briscolina and Elsie Farmer, both 14, disappeared in October 1972. Farmer's remains were found in January 1973, and Briscolina's remains were discovered the following month. Items associated with Briscolina were among Schaefer's possessions. Yet those discoveries did not produce a murder conviction against him. Colette Goodenough and Barbara Wilcox, both 19, had disappeared after leaving Biloxi, Mississippi, while attempting to hitchhike back to Florida in January 1973. Investigators found Goodenoug's passport, diary, and poetry books, as well as Wilcox's driver's license. Their remains were eventually found in Port St. Lucie in 1977. The cause of death could not be clearly determined, and Schaefer was never prosecuted for their deaths. As investigators assembled these cases, A list of missing people associated with Schaefer began to circulate. A figure of 28 missing or murdered people was reported in connection with the investigation. But the number required caution. Not every person on such a list was necessarily a victim of Schaefer. Some were later found alive. Others died in circumstances that were not connected to him. The number therefore represented the breadth of the investigation, not a confirmed victim count. This distinction is essential to understanding the case. Gerard John Schaefer was unquestionably convicted of 2 murders. Beyond those 2, the evidence varies considerably from case to case. Some investigations involved physical objects. Some involved later statements attributed to Schaefer. Some were based primarily on investigative suspicion. These categories cannot be merged without losing the difference between what is known and what remains unresolved. By May 1973, however, prosecutors had enough to move forward with the 2 cases that mattered most in court. On May 18th, Schaefer was formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Susan Place and Georgia Jessup. The charges did not establish that he had killed every woman whose belongings had been found. They established the specific accusations that the state intended to prove against him. The search had therefore done 2 things at once. It had strengthened the case involving Susan and Georgia, particularly through the discovery of Susan's wallet, while also opening a much larger investigation into Schaefer's possible involvement in other disappearances. For investigators, the objects found in the search represented potential answers. For the families of missing women, they represented something more complicated, the possibility that a long unsolved disappearance might finally have a connection, but also the painful reality that a connection was not necessarily a solution. And for the courtroom that awaited Schaefer, the central question would become narrower than the growing list of names. It would not be whether Gerard John Schaefer was a disturbing figure, or whether investigators had reasons to suspect him in numerous cases. It would be whether the evidence could prove that he had murdered Susan Place and Georgia Jessup. The search had given investigators a disturbing collection of clues. Now they had to turn those clues into a case that could withstand the demands of a trial. By the spring of 1973, the investigation into Gerard John Schaefer had become larger than the 2 murder charges that would eventually bring him before a jury. The search of his mother's home had produced belongings associated with several missing women and girls, along with firearms, knives, photographs, and hundreds of pages of writings and drawings concerning violence and murder. Yet the most important task for investigators was not simply to collect suspicious material. It was to determine what each item meant, where it came from, and whether it could establish a connection between Schaefer and a particular disappearance. The difference between suspicion and proof became increasingly important as the list of names grew. Susan Place and Georgia Jessup were the 2 victims for whose death Schaefer would ultimately stand trial. Other women and girls occupied a more uncertain position in the investigation. Some were represented by possessions found among Schaefer's property. Some had remains discovered after they disappeared. Some were linked to statements Schaefer made years later. But none of those additional cases resulted in a murder conviction against him. One of the earliest names to attract investigators' attention was Lee Hainline Bonadies. Bonadies was 25 when she disappeared from Fort Lauderdale in 1969. Her disappearance had remained unresolved. During the search connected to Schaefer, investigators found jewelry associated with her. The discovery naturally raised a serious question. How had personal property belonging to a missing woman come to be connected with a deputy sheriff who was now being investigated for murder? The existence of the jewelry gave investigators a reason to examine Bonadies' disappearance in a new light. But it did not, by itself, establish that Schaefer had killed her. Bonadies' remains were eventually found, yet Schaefer was never prosecuted for her death. The same distinction applied to Carmen Marie Hallock, who was 22 when she disappeared in 1969. Investigators found items they believed were connected to Hallock among Schaefer's possessions. One particularly disturbing piece of evidence was a tooth that was identified by Hollock's dentist. The discovery appeared to offer another possible connection between Schaefer and a missing woman. But once again, the investigation did not lead to a murder conviction. The names continued. Belinda Hutchins, who disappeared in 1972, was represented by an address book found among Schaefer's possessions. The address book did not explain where Hutchins was or what had happened to her, but its presence added another unanswered question to the growing investigation. Investigators also found personal belongings associated with Colette Goodenough and Barbara Wilcox. Both women were 19 years old and had disappeared after leaving Biloxi, Mississippi, while attempting to hitchhike back to Florida in January 1973. Their story was particularly significant because the two women had disappeared together. They had left Biloxi and were attempting to return to Florida when they vanished. In the search connected to Schaefer, investigators found Colette Goodenough's passport, diary, and books of poetry. They also found Barbara Wilcox's driver's license. Once again, the objects raised the possibility of a connection, but they did not provide the complete chain of evidence necessary for a murder prosecution. The remains of Goodenough and Wilcox were eventually discovered in Port St. Lucie in 1977. Yet the cause of death could not be clearly determined, and Schaefer was never charged with their murders. For investigators, the discovery of their belongings must have been significant because it gave physical form to cases that otherwise consisted largely of missing person reports and unanswered questions. For the families, however, the distinction was painful. Finding a loved one's possession could confirm that the missing person had crossed paths with someone under investigation, but it did not necessarily explain what had happened to them. The same uncertainty surrounded Mary Alice Briscolina and Elsie Farmer. Both were 14 years old when they disappeared in October 1972. Farmer's remains were found in January 1973, while Briscolina's remains were discovered the following month. Among the possessions associated with Schaefer was an item of jewelry connected to Briscolina. Again, the discovery strengthened suspicion, but it did not become a murder conviction. The cases of the two girls also demonstrated how complicated the timeline surrounding Schaefer had become. Their disappearances occurred after Nancy Trotter and Pamela Wells had accused him of the earlier attack in July 1972. They also occurred before Susan Place and Georgia Jessup were found in 1973. Investigators, therefore, had to examine not only individual cases but also the chronology of Schaefer's movements and the timing of multiple disappearances. Another pair of names would later become especially important: Peggy Ron and Wendy Stevenson. On December 29, 1970, Peggy, 9, and Wendy, 8, disappeared from a beach in Pompano Beach. They were children, and their disappearance was therefore especially devastating. A nearby store employee reported seeing a man buying ice cream for two young girls. The description of the man was considered consistent with Schaefer, but consistency was not the same as identification, and there was no immediate evidence sufficient to establish that Schaefer had taken the children. He denied involvement. The case remained unresolved. Years later, in a letter written in 1989, Schaefer made a statement that was treated as a confession involving the two girls. Yet even that later statement did not become a murder conviction. The case remained outside the two murders for which Schaefer had been formally convicted. That fact illustrates another difficulty in assessing his legacy. A statement made by the accused can be powerful, but it still has to be considered alongside independent evidence. Without sufficient corroboration, an alleged confession cannot simply transform an unresolved disappearance into a proven murder. Schaefer's own writings and statements, therefore, became another complicated part of the investigation. Some material found in his possession contained violent and disturbing descriptions. Investigators regarded the writings as evidence that he had a serious preoccupation with violence, torture, murder, and sexualized acts. Schaefer himself offered an explanation. He said that the writings represented thoughts he had recorded following advice from a psychiatrist. That explanation did not remove the disturbing nature of the material, but it demonstrated why the investigators and prosecutors had to distinguish between evidence of character and evidence of a specific crime. A person can write about violence without necessarily committing every act described. In a criminal trial, the central question is not whether the defendant appears disturbing. It is whether the evidence establishes responsibility for the particular offense charged. That distinction would become crucial when the investigation was eventually presented to a jury. By this stage, reports had begun associating Schaefer with a much larger number of missing or murdered people. A list of 28 names appeared in connection with the investigation. Over time, even larger numbers would be repeated in discussions of Schaefer, sometimes 20 or 30 possible victims. But these numbers have to be understood carefully. They did not represent 28 or 30 murders proven in court. Some people on investigative lists were later found alive. Some died in circumstances that did not establish a connection to Schaefer. Others were cases in which investigators suspected him but never obtained enough evidence to prosecute. The two murders that remained legally established were Susan Place and Georgia Jessup. The rest existed in varying degrees of uncertainty. That uncertainty does not mean the other cases were unimportant. Quite the opposite. Every missing person represented a family waiting for answers. Every unidentified photograph or personal possession raised the possibility that an old disappearance might finally have an explanation. But responsible accounts of the case must preserve the difference between an unresolved suspicion and a proven fact. This is particularly important because Schaefer himself became part of that uncertainty. His statements sometimes appeared to connect him to additional crimes, but they did not always provide the independent evidence necessary to establish those crimes beyond doubt. The result was a case with two sharply defined legal conclusions and a much larger shadow of unresolved allegations. By May 18, 1973, the state had formally charged Schaefer with 2 counts of first-degree murder for Susan Place and Georgia Jessup. The prosecution now had to move from the broad world of suspicion into the narrower world of trial. Evidence. Investigators had collected the wallet, personal belongings, witness accounts, the circumstances surrounding the discovery of the remains, and the earlier testimony of Nancy Trotter and Pamela Wells. Each piece had to be examined for what it actually proved. The prosecution could not simply place 28 names before a jury and ask the jurors to infer guilt. It had to establish the deaths of Susan and Georgia and Schaefer's responsibility for them. Meanwhile, the investigation into the other cases continued to cast a shadow over the proceedings. The names of Bonadies, Hollock, Hutchins, Goodenough, Wilcox, Briscolina, Farmer, Ron, and Stevenson represented unresolved stories surrounding Schaefer. Some had possessions found among his property. Some had remains recovered. Some had later statements attributed to him. But none of these cases altered the legal fact at the center of the upcoming trial. Schaefer was going to court for 2 murders. The question before the jury would be whether the evidence surrounding Susan Place and Georgia Jessup was sufficient to establish his guilt. And behind that legal question was a human one. Susan and Georgia had been 16 and 17 years old. Their final journey began with a simple plan to go to the beach and play guitar. They left with a man Susan believed she knew. They never returned. 6 months later, their remains were found. Whatever else might eventually be said about Gerard Schaefer, their deaths were not speculation. They were the foundation of the case. The courtroom would now have to reconstruct what happened to them, step by step, and decide whether the man who had once worn the badge of a deputy sheriff was responsible for taking 2 young lives. By May 1973, the investigation had reached a decisive stage. Gerard John Schaefer was no longer simply a deputy sheriff whose conduct had been questioned by 2 surviving teenagers. He was formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Susan Carroll Place and Georgia Marie Jessup. The charges were specific, and so were the victims. Susan was 17. Georgia was 16. They had left Fort Lauderdale together on September 27, 1972, intending to go to the beach and play guitar with a man Susan knew as Jerry Shepard or Shepard. They never returned. 6 months later, their remains were discovered in the Port St. Lucie and Hutchinson Island area, near the area associated with Blind Creek. Dental records identified them on April 5th. The investigation now had to move from the world of missing person reports and investigative suspicion into the much narrower world of criminal prosecution. The state had to prove that Susan and Georgia had been murdered and that Gerard Schaefer was responsible. The wider collection of names surrounding him could not substitute for that burden. Investigators had discovered belongings associated with numerous missing women. They had uncovered violent writings and drawings. They had the testimony of Nancy Trotter and Pamela Wells. They had the circumstances surrounding the discovery of Susan and Georgia. But each piece of evidence had to be considered for what it actually demonstrated. The prosecution could not simply ask a jury to conclude that because Schaefer appeared connected to several disturbing cases, he must therefore be guilty of the 2 murders charged against him. The trial would have to establish a specific case. The first major challenge concerned the identity of the man Susan had known as Jerry Shepard or Shepard. Lucille Place had seen the man before Susan and Georgia left. She had also seen the vehicle and recorded its license plate number. Her observation became an important part of the reconstruction of the girls' final known movements. The information gave investigators a starting point for examining Schaefer's possible connection to the girls. At the same time, Schaefer denied knowing Susan and Georgia. His denial created a direct conflict between his account and the evidence investigators were assembling. The prosecution would have to show the jury why the evidence pointed towards Schaefer despite his claim that he had no connection with the teenagers. Another important element was the testimony of Nancy Trotter and Pamela Wells. Unlike Susan and Georgia, Nancy and Pamela could describe their encounter with Schaefer themselves. Their account was direct and personal. They said that Schaefer had told them hitchhiking was illegal, offered them a ride, taken them to an isolated wooded area, tied them to a tree, and placed nooses around their necks. They survived because Schaefer left after receiving a police radio call. Their testimony therefore provided investigators with an account of Schaefer allegedly controlling young women in an isolated location, when Susan and Georgia were later found dead, with evidence suggesting that they too had been restrained and tied to a tree. The similarity became an important part of the prosecution's case. It was not simply a matter of 2 unrelated stories involving young women and trees. The earlier incident had placed Schaefer directly inside an investigation involving physical restraint of teenage girls. The later deaths created a second set of circumstances involving 2 teenage girls, an isolated location, and evidence of restraint. The similarities did not independently prove the murders, but they gave the jury a context in which the testimony of Trotter and Wells could become highly significant. The physical evidence also mattered. Susan and Georgia had not been found immediately. Their remains were discovered more than 6 months after their disappearance. That meant investigators had to work with what remained rather than with a fresh crime scene. The identification through dental records established who the victims were. The recorded injuries provided information about violence. Susan was noted as having suffered a gunshot injury to the jaw area. The circumstances suggested that the girls had been restrained and tied to a tree. Together, these details established that the deaths were not simply unexplained disappearances. There was evidence of homicide, but the central legal question remained: who had caused those deaths? The search of Schaefer's mother's home became important because investigators had found a wallet, identified as Susan Place's. They had also found objects associated with several other missing women. Schaefer offered explanations for these items. He said Susan's wallet had been purchased in Morocco. He said some documents connected to missing women had been found while he was on patrol. He said Lee Bonadies' jewelry had been given to him as a gift. He described his violent writings as thoughts he had recorded following the advice of a psychiatrist. And concerning material connected to Carmen Hollock, he suggested that someone else might have placed it among his possessions. These explanations gave the prosecution another issue to address. It was not enough to say that the objects were disturbing. The state had to show the jury why the evidence pointed toward Schaefer's responsibility rather than toward his alternative explanations. The same issue applied to the larger collection of suspected victims. Lee Bonadies, Carmen Hollock, Belinda Hutchins, Mary Alice Briscolina, Elsie Farmer, Colette Goodenough, Barbara Wilcox, Peggy Ron, and Wendy Stevenson were among the names associated with the broader investigation. Their cases were deeply troubling, but they were not all equally supported by evidence. Some involved possessions found among Schaefer's belongings. Some involved remains discovered after disappearance. Some involved later statements attributed to Schaefer. Some were based primarily on investigative suspicion. The prosecution, therefore, had to keep its focus on Susan and Georgia. Their deaths were the cases in which Schaefer was actually charged. The distinction became especially important because the public discussion surrounding the investigation could easily make the number of suspected victims seem like a single established fact. Reports associated Schaefer with as many as 28 missing or murdered people. Later accounts would sometimes use numbers such as 20 or 30. But those figures did not mean that 20 or 30 murders had been proven. Some people on investigative lists were later found alive. Others died in circumstances that could not be linked to Schaefer. And for many of the remaining cases, there was insufficient evidence to bring a murder charge. The legal case, therefore, remained much narrower than the mythology surrounding the name killer. Before the trial, Schaefer also underwent psychiatric evaluation at Florida State Hospital. The evaluation became another significant part of the case because his psychological condition had already been a concern before his entry into law enforcement. He had previously been rejected by the Broward County Sheriff's Office after failing a psychological examination. Later, he worked for approximately 6 months at the Wilton Manors Police Department before being dismissed. Despite this history, he eventually became a deputy sheriff with the Martin County Sheriff's Office in 1972. After his arrest, doctors evaluated his mental condition. According to the information available in the case, the evaluation identified paranoia, psychosis, severe sexual deviance, depression, and suicidal thoughts. One particularly disturbing assessment concerned his apparent tendency to view himself as someone with the authority to eliminate women he considered immoral. Yet the psychiatric findings did not prevent the case from going to trial. Despite the problems identified in the evaluation, doctors concluded that Schaefer was legally competent to stand trial. That distinction was important. Mental illness or psychological disturbance did not automatically determine whether a defendant was competent to participate in legal proceedings. The question was whether Schaefer was capable of facing the charges against him in court. The answer was yes. As the prosecution prepared its case, the earlier allegations by Trotter and Wells remained an important part of the narrative. Their survival gave the investigation something that was absent in the Place and Jessup murders: living witnesses who could describe Schaefer's conduct. They could explain how the encounter began, what he told them, where he took them, and how he restrained them. Their testimony would allow the jury to hear directly from women who had experienced Schaefer's alleged use of authority and physical control. For Susan and Georgia, no such testimony existed. Their final hours had to be reconstructed from other evidence. The prosecution, therefore, had to build a bridge between two different kinds of information: the direct testimony of survivors and the physical evidence surrounding the deaths of two girls who could no longer speak. By September 1973, that bridge would be tested in court. The trial began on September 17th in St. Lucie County. The prosecution entered the courtroom with two specific accusations: a collection of physical evidence, the testimony of surviving witnesses, and a defendant who denied responsibility. Schaefer's defense would present its own explanation of the circumstances, including witnesses who said he had been at home around the time Susan and Georgia disappeared. Those alibi claims would have to be considered alongside the evidence presented by the state. The jury would ultimately have to decide which account was more convincing. At stake was not merely Schaefer's freedom. The case represented the first opportunity for Susan Place and Georgia Jessup to receive a formal judgment about the people responsible for their deaths. Their disappearance had remained unanswered for more than 6 months. Their families had lived with uncertainty until the discovery and identification of the remains. Now, 1 year after the girls vanished, the man accused of killing them was finally standing before a jury. The trial would force the case into a sequence of evidence: where the girls went, who they were with, what happened after they disappeared, where their remains were found, what investigators discovered in connection with Schaefer, what the surviving witnesses remembered, and whether his explanations could withstand the evidence. After months of investigation, the case had reached its most demanding stage. Suspicion would no longer be enough. The state had to prove murder, and the jury had to decide whether Gerard John Schaefer was guilty of killing Susan Place and Georgia Jessup. On September 17, 1973, the case against Gerard John Schaefer entered the courtroom in St. Lucie County. The trial was no longer about a missing person investigation, an expanding list of possible victims, or the disturbing collection of objects discovered during the search of his mother's home. The legal question had become precise. Had Gerard Schaefer murdered Susan Carroll Place and Georgia Marie Jessup? The two girls had disappeared on September 27, 1972. Susan was 17, Georgia was 16. 6 months later, their remains were found in the Port St. Lucie and Hutchinson Island area, near the area associated with Blind Creek. Their identities were confirmed through dental records on April 5, 1973. Now, almost a year after they disappeared, the state was asking a jury to determine who was responsible for their deaths. The prosecution's case rested on a collection of circumstances rather than a single piece of evidence. The state had the account provided by Lucille Place, Susan's mother, who had seen the man the girls left with and had recorded the vehicle's license plate. There was the evidence surrounding the remains. There was the wallet identified as Susan's, discovered during the search connected to Schaefer. There was the testimony of Nancy Trotter and Pamela Wells, two young women who had survived an earlier encounter with him. And there were the explanations Schaefer had provided for the various objects discovered among his possessions. The prosecution had to present these pieces as parts of one coherent case while avoiding the danger of treating suspicion as proof. The testimony of Nancy Trotter and Pamela Wells was especially important because they could speak from personal experience. They told investigators and later the court about the encounter that had occurred in July 1972. According to their account, Schaefer approached them while he was working as a deputy sheriff. He told them that hitchhiking was illegal and offered to take them somewhere. Instead of simply transporting them, however, he drove them to an isolated wooded area. There, according to the girls, he tied them to a tree and placed nooses around their necks. They were forced to maintain their bodies in a position that prevented the ropes from tightening. The danger was immediate and physical. Their ability to survive depended partly on remaining in that position. Schaefer eventually left after receiving a call over his police radio. The girls used his absence to escape and report the incident. Their testimony gave the jury a direct account of behavior that had occurred before Susan and Georgia disappeared. The prosecution could point to the similarities without claiming that the earlier incident alone proved the later murders. The earlier victims were alive. Susan and Georgia were not. Yet the similarities were difficult to overlook. Young women, an isolated area, restrained against a tree, and ropes placed around the neck. The jury also had to consider the significance of Susan's final known movements. Lucille Place had seen the man who came to meet Susan in Georgia. Susan had identified him as Jerry Shepard or Shepard. Her mother had seen the vehicle and written down the license plate. That information became an important part of the effort to determine who had been with the girls. Schaefer denied knowing Susan and Georgia. The defense, therefore, had to confront the prosecution's attempt to connect him to their final journey. The state also presented evidence concerning the search of Schaefer's mother's home. The wallet identified as Susan Place's was particularly important. It was not merely a generic object. It was identified as belonging to one of the two girls whose deaths were being tried. Schaefer's explanation was that he had purchased the wallet in Morocco. The jury therefore had to consider whether that explanation was credible in light of the rest of the evidence. The search had also uncovered jewelry associated with Lee Bonadies. Possessions believed to be connected to Carmen Hollock, the address book of Belinda Hutchins, Colette Goodenoug's passport, diary and poetry books, Barbara Wilcox's driver's license, and an item of jewelry associated with Mary Alice Briscolina. These discoveries gave the prosecution a broader picture of Schaefer's relationship to missing women. But the state still had to keep the legal focus on Place and Jessup. The other names could demonstrate the investigative context, but they could not substitute for proof of the two murders charged. The weapons and violent writings found during the search presented another difficult issue. Investigators had discovered firearms, knives, photographs of unidentified women, and hundreds of pages of writings and drawings involving violence and murder. Some of the material was described as containing disturbing themes involving torture, killing, and sexual violence. For investigators, the material reinforced their belief that Schaefer was capable of serious violence. But a courtroom demanded a more exact standard. A violent drawing could show what someone imagined or wrote about. It did not automatically demonstrate that the person had carried out the act depicted. Schaefer said the writings were thoughts he had recorded following advice from a psychiatrist. His explanation did not eliminate the disturbing character of the material, but the jury had to determine what weight it deserved in relation to the actual murder charges. The prosecution also had to address the psychiatric evidence. Schaefer had undergone evaluation at Florida State Hospital. Doctors found signs of paranoia, psychosis, severe sexual deviance, depression, and suicidal thoughts. He was also described as having a tendency to see himself as someone entitled to eliminate women he considered immoral. Yet despite these findings, doctors concluded that he was legally competent to stand trial. The psychiatric evidence, therefore, did not remove the case from the courtroom. Instead, it became part of the larger picture surrounding the defendant. The defense sought to challenge the prosecution's version of events. Schaefer denied killing Susan and Georgia. He offered explanations for the possessions investigators had found. He also presented witnesses who supported his claim that he had been at home around the time the two girls disappeared. The alibi evidence was important because it offered the jury an alternative account of where Schaefer had been. If accepted, it could weaken the prosecution's timeline. If rejected, it would leave the state's other evidence standing with greater force. The jury therefore had to evaluate not only physical evidence and testimony, but also credibility. Which witnesses were reliable? Which explanations made sense when considered against the entire case? Could Schaefer's explanations for the wallet and other objects reasonably account for their presence? And did the testimony of Trotter and Wells, the evidence surrounding the remains, and the information about Susan's final known movements collectively establish his responsibility? These questions were not answered instantly. The case required the jurors to reconstruct events that had occurred a year earlier. They had to look backward through missing person reports, witness memories, physical evidence, and competing explanations. The emotional weight of the case was also unavoidable. Susan and Georgia were teenagers. They had left together with a plan to go to the beach and play guitar. Their families had waited for their return. Instead, months later, their remains were discovered. The trial was therefore not simply an examination of evidence. It was an attempt to establish a final legal account of what had happened to two young women who could no longer provide one themselves. The defense could challenge individual pieces of evidence, but the prosecution's case depended on how those pieces fit together. A single item might have an explanation. A single witness might be mistaken. A disturbing drawing might represent fantasy rather than reality. But the state argued that the combined circumstances pointed toward Schaefer. The earlier encounter with Trotter and Wells provided a documented pattern of alleged restraint. Lucille Place provided information about the man and vehicle associated with the girl's final known movements. The remains established that Susan and Georgia had died violently. The wallet connected Susan directly to property found in circumstances associated with Schaefer. The other objects and writings formed the broader context of the investigation. The defense, meanwhile, insisted that suspicion should not be confused with proof and offered explanations and alibi testimony. After the evidence was presented, the jury was left with the central responsibility of the trial, deciding whether the prosecution had established guilt beyond the required legal standard. The decision would have consequences not only for Schaefer, but also for the families of Susan Place and Georgia Jessup. The trial had begun on September 17th. By its conclusion, the jury would have to decide whether the evidence had transformed the suspicions surrounding Gerard Schaefer into a proven case of first-degree murder. On September 27, 1973, exactly 1 year after Susan Place and Georgia Jessup disappeared, that decision finally arrived. After more than 5 hours of deliberation, the jury found Gerard John Schaefer guilty of both counts of first-degree murder. The verdict provided the legal answer to the deaths of Susan and Georgia. It did not solve every disappearance associated with Schaefer's name. It did not prove that he had killed every woman whose belongings had been found. It did not turn the investigative list of possible victims into a confirmed list of murders. But it established two facts in a court of law. Susan Place had been murdered, Georgia Jessup had been murdered, and Gerard John Schaefer was legally responsible for both deaths. The verdict was also significant because of what it represented to the surviving witnesses. Nancy Trotter and Pamela Wells had come forward after escaping from their own encounter with Schaefer. Their testimony had become part of the investigation that ultimately led to the murder case. Susan and Georgia had not survived to tell their story. The courtroom, therefore, had to rely on the evidence and on those who could speak about the events surrounding them. The verdict could not restore either girl. It could not answer every question, but it established accountability for the two murders that had been proven. Schaefer now faced sentencing. The state had secured 2 first-degree murder convictions, yet the punishment would not be death. The reason was rooted in the legal history of Florida at the time. The Supreme Court's 1972 decision in Furman v. Georgia had affected the application of capital punishment, and the death penalty was not available in the way it might be under later Florida law. Schaefer therefore received 2 life sentences to be served concurrently. The man who had entered law enforcement and carried the authority of a deputy sheriff was now a convicted double murderer serving life in prison. Yet the case was not truly finished. The verdict answered 2 questions. It left many others open, and those unanswered questions would follow Schaefer for the remainder of his life. The guilty verdict on September 27, 1973, brought a legal conclusion to the murders of Susan Place and Georgia Jessup, but it did not bring a complete conclusion to the larger investigation surrounding Gerard John Schaefer. After more than 5 hours of deliberation, the jury had found him guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. Exactly 1 year had passed since Susan and Georgia disappeared from Fort Lauderdale. Their families finally had a judicial answer to the question of responsibility for their deaths. But the verdict established only what the court had been asked to decide. It did not establish that Schaefer had committed every disappearance associated with his name. It did not resolve the cases of Lee Bonadies, Carmen Hollock, Belinda Hutchins, Mary Alice Briscolina, Elsie Farmer, Colette Goodenough, Barbara Wilcox, Peggy Ron, or Wendy Stevenson. Those cases remained in different categories of suspicion, evidence, and uncertainty. That distinction is essential because the image of Schaefer as a possible serial killer eventually became much larger than the two murders for which he was convicted. The evidence surrounding the other cases was disturbing, but a courtroom conviction requires more than a collection of unanswered questions. Schaefer received 2 life sentences to be served concurrently. He was not sentenced to death. The legal circumstances of the period were important. The Supreme Court's 1972 decision in Furman v. Georgia had affected the use of capital punishment, and Florida's death penalty system was in a period of major legal uncertainty. As a result, the prosecution did not seek to have Schaefer executed for the murders of Susan and Georgia. Instead, he entered prison with 2 life sentences. The sentence meant that the man convicted of killing the 2 teenagers would spend the remainder of his life behind bars unless his legal circumstances changed. But prison did not end the questions surrounding him. In the years that followed, Schaefer continued to deny many of the allegations against him. At the same time, he produced letters and other writings that contained statements interpreted as admissions of involvement in additional crimes. This created a complicated situation for investigators and later researchers. A confession can appear definitive, especially when it concerns a specific victim or event. But a confession is not automatically equivalent to a conviction. Investigators still need independent evidence capable of establishing what happened. In some of the cases associated with Schaefer, that independent evidence was missing, incomplete, or insufficient for prosecution. The distinction became especially important when discussing the number of possible victims. A figure of 28 missing or murdered people was associated with the investigation. Later accounts sometimes referred to 20 or 30 possible victims. But those numbers should never be presented as though they represented 20 or 30 murders proven against Schaefer. Some people included in investigative lists were later found alive. Others died in circumstances that could not be connected to him. Some cases contained suspicious evidence, such as possessions found among his belongings, but no sufficient proof of murder. Others involved statements attributed to Schaefer without enough independent evidence to establish the crime in court. The result was a complicated spectrum. At one end were Susan Place and Georgia Jessup, whose murders produced convictions. At another were people whose names appeared only because investigators suspected a possible connection. Between those extremes were cases containing physical objects, recovered remains, witness information, or later statements, but not enough evidence for a murder conviction. One of the most significant unresolved cases involved Lee Hainline Barajas. She was 25 when she disappeared from Fort Lauderdale in 1969. Jewelry associated with Barajas was found among Schaefer's possessions. Her remains were later discovered. Those facts made the case deeply troubling, but Schaefer was never convicted of her murder. The evidence created suspicion, but did not establish the legal responsibility required for a conviction. Carmen Marie Hallock was another woman whose disappearance became associated with Schaefer. Hallock was 22 when she disappeared in 1969. Investigators found material believed to be connected to her, including a tooth identified by her dentist. Again, the discovery raised serious questions, but Schaefer was never convicted in connection with Hallock's death. The cases of Mary Alice Briscolina and Elsie Farmer were equally disturbing. Both girls were 14 when they disappeared in October 1972. Farmer's remains were found in January 1973, and Briscolina's remains were discovered the following month. An item of jewelry associated with Briscolina was among the possessions connected to Schaefer. Yet the evidence did not result in a murder conviction against him. Their deaths remain part of the larger, unresolved picture surrounding the former deputy sheriff. Colette Goodenough and Barbara Wilcox were another pair whose disappearance raised questions. Both were 19. They disappeared after leaving Biloxi, Mississippi, in January 1973 while attempting to hitchhike back to Florida. Investigators later found Goodenough's passport, diary, and poetry books and Wilcox's driver's license among possessions associated with Schaefer. Their remains were eventually discovered in Port St. Lucie in 1977. However, the cause of death could not be clearly determined. Without a clear cause of death and sufficient evidence linking Schaefer to the deaths, prosecutors did not charge him with their murders. Their case therefore remained unresolved even though their belongings had appeared in the investigation. Then there were Peggy Ron and Wendy Stevenson. Their disappearance was particularly haunting because they were children. Peggy was 9 and Wendy was 8 when they disappeared from a beach in Pompano Beach on December 29, 1970. A store employee reported seeing a man buying ice cream for 2 young girls. The description was considered consistent with Schaefer. But consistency was not enough to establish that he was the man who had taken them. Schaefer denied involvement. The girls were never found, and the case remained unresolved. Years later, in a letter written in 1989, Schaefer made a statement concerning the 2 children that was interpreted as a confession. Yet the statement did not produce a murder conviction. This distinction remains important even when discussing the possibility that the confession was genuine. Without sufficient independent evidence, the legal status of the case remained fundamentally different from the Place and Jessup murders. The unresolved cases also demonstrate why the phrase killer cop can sometimes obscure the actual history. Schaefer was indeed a former deputy sheriff who was convicted of 2 murders. He had also been accused by 2 teenage survivors of using his authority to take them to an isolated location and restrain them. Those facts alone make the case extraordinary. But the larger claim that he was responsible for dozens of murders goes beyond what was established in court. The investigation's breadth should not be confused with the certainty of its conclusions. This does not diminish the seriousness of the other cases. For families of missing people, suspicion can be devastating precisely because it leaves questions unanswered. If a possession belonging to a missing person is found in someone else's home, the discovery may create hope that investigators have finally found a direction. But if there is not enough evidence to prove what happened, the family may remain without a definitive answer. The same is true when remains are discovered but the cause of death cannot be established. The discovery may end the uncertainty over whether the missing person is alive, while leaving unanswered the most painful question of all: how did they die? In Schaefer's case, these unresolved questions accumulated around a man already convicted of 2 murders that made every new connection more difficult to evaluate objectively. The confirmed convictions inevitably influenced how investigators viewed other cases. Yet the proper standard remained the same. Suspicion had to be separated from proof. Evidence had to be separated from interpretation. And statements attributed to Schaefer had to be distinguished from convictions established through independent evidence. His later writings and letters added another layer of complexity. Some appeared to contain admissions involving other crimes. But Schaefer was not brought to trial for most of those allegations. He therefore died without a complete judicial accounting of the cases associated with his name. His 2 life sentences remained the legal foundation of his imprisonment. The larger question, how many victims, if any, could truly be attributed to him beyond Susan and Georgia, remained unresolved. This uncertainty followed him for decades. It also shaped the way his story would later be remembered. The public often prefers a simple number: 20 victims, 30 victims, a serial killer with a precise total. But the historical record was not that simple. There were 2 murders established beyond the required legal standard. There were numerous other cases involving varying degrees of suspicion. There were possessions, remains, witness accounts, investigative theories, and later statements. Some connections were strong enough to provoke serious investigation. None of them changed the fact that Schaefer's only murder convictions were for Susan Place and Georgia Jessup. As the years passed, Schaefer remained imprisoned under those 2 life sentences. The man who had once used the appearance and authority of law enforcement to approach young women had lost his freedom permanently. But for the families whose cases remained unresolved, his imprisonment did not necessarily provide closure. A conviction in one case could not answer another family's questions. A life sentence could not explain every unexplained disappearance. And a confession without corroborating evidence could not automatically replace the certainty of a courtroom verdict. The story of Gerard Schaefer therefore entered its final chapter with two different realities, existing side by side. One was certain: Susan Place and Georgia Jessup were murdered, and Gerard John Schaefer was convicted of both killings. The other remained uncertain: whether he was responsible for the many additional disappearances and deaths that investigators associated with him. That distinction would remain important until the end of his life. And eventually, even that end would come inside the prison where he had spent more than 2 decades. On December 3, 1995, Gerard John Schaefer was stabbed to death by another inmate, Vincent Faustino Rivera, inside a Florida prison. He died while serving the 2 life sentences imposed for the murders of Susan Place and Georgia Jessup. His death closed the possibility of bringing him before a court for most of the other cases connected to his name. Whatever answers he might have provided, whatever further claims he might have made, and whatever evidence might have emerged could no longer be tested through a new criminal trial. The unresolved cases remained unresolved. Susan and Georgia had received their verdict. Many other families never received the same certainty. The conviction of Gerard John Schaefer for the murders of Susan Place and Georgia Jessup established a legal boundary around the case. Inside that boundary were 2 victims, 2 murders, and 2 convictions. Beyond it lay a much larger landscape of disappearances, recovered remains, suspicious possessions, and statements attributed to Schaefer over the years. It was this second landscape that made the case so difficult to understand. The question was no longer simply whether Schaefer had murdered Susan and Georgia. A jury had already answered that question. The question that remained was whether the evidence surrounding the other missing women and girls could establish that Schaefer had committed additional killings. In many cases, the answer never reached the courtroom. One of the most important principles in examining Schaefer's history is therefore the distinction between a suspected victim and a proven victim. Investigators may have had reasons to connect a disappearance to him. They may have found a possession belonging to a missing woman in circumstances that appeared highly suspicious. Schaefer himself may later have made statements that sounded like admissions. But none of these circumstances automatically produced a conviction. The additional cases must therefore be considered individually, with the same caution that applies to any unresolved homicide investigation. Lee Hainline Bonadies was one of the earliest women whose disappearance became associated with Schaefer. She was 25 when she disappeared from Fort Lauderdale in 1969. Years later, investigators searching property connected to Schaefer discovered jewelry associated with her. The discovery was deeply significant because personal property can provide a tangible connection between a missing person and another individual. But the discovery could not, by itself, establish the circumstances in which the jewelry had changed hands. Bonadis's remains were eventually found, adding another painful dimension to the case. Yet Schaefer was never convicted of her murder. Her name therefore belongs in the category of a case that generated serious suspicion, not in the category of a homicide legally established against him. Carmen Marie Hallock presented a similar problem. Hallock was 22 when she disappeared in 1969. Among the material investigators associated with Schaefer was an item believed to be connected to her. Particularly notable was a tooth that was identified by Hallock's dentist. Such an identification could make the connection appear more concrete than a vague similarity or rumor. Yet even with that evidence, Schaefer was not convicted in Hallock's disappearance. The case remained part of the larger investigation, but never became one of the murders for which he was legally held responsible. Belinda Hutchins was another name that emerged during the search. She had disappeared in 1972, and investigators found her address book among the possessions associated with Schaefer. Again, the discovery raised an obvious question about how the object came into his possession. But an address book alone could not establish what had happened to Hutchins or prove that Schaefer had caused her disappearance. The investigation had to confront the possibility that evidence of association might not provide evidence of homicide. The same problem appeared in the cases of Mary Alice Briscolina and Elsie Farmer. Both girls were 14 years old when they disappeared in October 1972. Their ages make the cases especially painful to consider. They were children who vanished during a period when Schaefer had already come under scrutiny, following the incident involving Nancy Trotter and Pamela Wells. Farmer's remains were discovered in January 1973. Briscolina's remains were found the following month. Investigators also found an item of jewelry associated with Briscolina among the possessions linked to Schaefer. These discoveries made the possibility of a connection impossible to ignore. Yet once again, suspicion did not become a murder conviction. The circumstances surrounding the girls' deaths did not produce a case in which Schaefer was found legally responsible. Their names therefore remain part of the unresolved history surrounding him. Colette Goodenough and Barbara Wilcox represented another particularly troubling disappearance. Both women were 19. They had been traveling from Biloxi, Mississippi, toward Florida in January 1973, attempting to hitchhike home. Then they disappeared. Their belongings later appeared in the investigation of Schaefer. Investigators found Goodenough's passport, diary, and books of poetry, as well as Wilcox's driver's license. The objects were personal and specific. They were not anonymous items that could easily be dismissed as unrelated. Yet the existence of these belongings did not answer the most important questions. When had the women encountered Schaefer? How had their possessions come into his possession? What happened after they disappeared? The remains of both women were eventually found at Port St. Lucie in 1977. But their cause of death could not be clearly determined. Without a clear cause of death and sufficient evidence establishing Schaefer's responsibility, prosecutors did not charge him with their murders. Their story therefore illustrates one of the most difficult aspects of unresolved cases. Even when investigators recover remains and identify personal possessions, the evidence may still fail to reveal exactly how a person died. Then there were Peggy Ron and Wendy Stevenson, whose disappearance had occurred before Schaefer became a deputy sheriff. On December 29, 1970, Peggy, 9, and Wendy, 8, disappeared from a beach in Pompano Beach. A nearby store employee reported seeing a man buying ice cream for two young girls. The description of the man was considered consistent with Schaefer. That detail became significant because it offered investigators a possible link between him and the children. But it remained only a possible link. Schaefer denied involvement. The girls were never found. For years, the case remained an unresolved disappearance. Then, in 1989, long after Schaefer had been convicted and imprisoned for the Place and Jessup murders, he wrote a letter containing a statement that was interpreted as an admission involving Peggy and Wendy. The statement was extraordinary, but it did not result in a murder conviction. There was still insufficient independent evidence to establish the case in court. This is one of the most important distinctions in Schaefer's story. A person can say something that sounds like a confession, but a confession does not automatically provide all the facts necessary to establish a murder beyond a reasonable doubt. The statement has to be examined for reliability, consistency, and corroboration. In the case of Peggy and Wendy, the legal system never reached the same conclusion it had reached in the Place and Jessup murders. The girls remained missing, and Schaefer remained unconvicted of their deaths. These cases also demonstrate why the frequently repeated numbers associated with Schaefer need to be treated carefully. Reports and later accounts sometimes suggested that he could have been responsible for 20, 28, or even 30 victims. Those numbers emerged from the large number of disappearances and suspected connections examined by investigators. But they should not be presented as established victim totals. Some individuals appearing on investigative lists were eventually found alive. Some died under circumstances that did not implicate Schaefer. Others were connected to him through possessions or allegations that never produced sufficient evidence for prosecution. The difference between linked to an investigation and proven to be a victim is enormous. For families, however, the uncertainty could be almost as painful as the loss itself. A conviction gives a family a legal answer. An unresolved disappearance leaves a question that can persist for decades. Even the discovery of remains may not resolve that question if the cause of death cannot be determined. The families of Goodenough and Wilcox, for example, eventually learned that the women were dead, but the circumstances surrounding their deaths remained unclear. The families connected to Barajas, Hallock, Briscolina, Farmer, and others faced similar uncertainty about the role, if any, that Schaefer played. In this context, the belongings found during the 1973 search became symbols of both possibility and frustration. A wallet, a piece of jewelry, an address book, a passport, a diary, a driver's license. Each item belonged to a real person. Each had once been part of an ordinary life. When such objects appeared inside an investigation into murder, they became evidence. But they also represented people whose stories had been interrupted. The investigation could identify the object without necessarily identifying the exact chain of events that had placed it there. Schaefer's own explanations complicated matters further. He said Susan Place's wallet had been purchased in Morocco. He said some documents belonging to missing women had been picked up while he was on patrol. He said Bonadis's jewelry had been given to him as a gift. He said his violent writings were thoughts recorded following psychiatric advice. And concerning material associated with Hallock, he suggested that someone else might have placed it among his belongings. Investigators did not accept these explanations as sufficient, but their existence demonstrates why each piece of evidence had to be evaluated rather than simply added to a growing list of accusations. The psychological material discovered during the investigation also had to be treated carefully. Schaefer's writings and drawings contained disturbing material concerning violence, murder, torture, and sexualized acts. They contributed to investigators' perception of him as dangerous. Yet a violent fantasy is not proof that every event described actually occurred. The same principle applied to later statements. An admission can be important, but it cannot automatically replace physical evidence and independent corroboration. These unresolved cases also changed the way Schaefer was remembered. The two convictions were certain, but the suspected number of victims became part of the mythology surrounding him. The label killer cop suggested a much broader pattern than the courtroom could establish. That label was rooted in real events. Schaefer had been a deputy sheriff. He had been accused by two young women of abusing his authority to restrain them, and he had been convicted of murdering two teenagers. But beyond those convictions, the historical record becomes less certain. The responsible way to tell his story is therefore not to erase the unresolved cases, but to identify them honestly. Bonadise, Hallock, Hutchins, Briscolina, Farmer, Goodenough, Wilcox, Ron, and Stevenson should not disappear from the narrative simply because their cases never produce convictions. Their names matter because they belong to real people whose disappearances caused real suffering. At the same time, their cases should not be transformed into established Schaefer murders without sufficient proof. That balance is essential. The truth of a true crime story is not measured by how large the victim count sounds. It is measured by how carefully the evidence is separated from speculation. Gerard John Schaefer left behind two proven murders and a much larger collection of unanswered questions. Those questions would remain unresolved even after his death. And as the years passed, investigators would continue to examine old cases using newer forensic techniques, including DNA identification, One such development would come decades later, when the remains of another missing Florida woman were identified. Her name was Deborah Poole. The identification would reopen yet another question about whether the long shadow of Gerard Schaefer might extend farther than the cases that had already been examined. But even then, the distinction would remain the same. A possible connection was not the same as a proven murder. And that distinction would become increasingly important as the investigation moved into the modern era. For Gerard John Schaefer, the conviction for Susan Place and Georgia Jessup was the end of the legal uncertainty surrounding two murders. But it was not the end of the questions surrounding his name. He entered prison carrying 2 life sentences for first-degree murder. The verdict had established his responsibility for the deaths of 2 teenagers. Yet outside those convictions remained a collection of cases that had never received the same judicial resolution. Some involved missing women whose belongings had been found among possessions associated with Schaefer. Some involved remains discovered years after the disappearances. Some involved statements that Schaefer later made in letters or other writings. And some remained little more than investigative suspicions. The years inside prison, therefore, did not produce a simple conclusion. Instead, they created a strange second phase of the story, one in which Schaefer was already a convicted murderer, while investigators, journalists, and families continued to ask whether the full extent of his crimes had ever been discovered. One of the most persistent questions concerned the number of possible victims. 20, 28, 30. Different figures appeared in accounts of the investigation. But numbers can create an impression of certainty that the evidence does not support. The investigation had generated a large list of missing or murdered people who were thought to have possible connections to Schaefer. That was not the same thing as proving that he had killed them. Some individuals included on investigative lists were later found alive. Others died in circumstances that did not establish Schaefer's involvement. Still others were connected to him through possessions or statements that were suspicious but insufficient for prosecution. The 2 confirmed murder convictions, therefore, remained the firmest boundary around what could legally be said about him. Beyond that boundary, the evidence varied from case to case. Schaefer's own behavior after conviction complicated the picture even further. He continued to deny many of the accusations against him, but he also produced writings and letters containing statements interpreted as admissions concerning additional crimes. The most notable example involved Peggy Ron and Wendy Stevenson. The 2 girls had disappeared from Pompano Beach on December 29, 1970. Peggy was 9 and Wendy was 8. A store employee had reported seeing a man buying ice cream for 2 girls, and the description was considered consistent with Schaefer. For years, however, there was no definitive evidence establishing what had happened to the children or who was responsible. Schaefer denied involvement. Then, in 1989, nearly 2 decades after the girls disappeared and 16 years after his conviction for the Place and Jessup murders, he wrote a letter containing a statement interpreted as a confession involving them. It was an extraordinary development, but it did not transform the case into a conviction. The girls had never been found, and the statement did not provide the independent evidence necessary to establish the murders in court. The case therefore remained unresolved despite the disturbing statement attributed to Schaefer. That distinction is central to understanding the final decades of his life. A confession can seem to answer a question, but the legal system requires more than a declaration. Investigators need evidence that can be tested. Prosecutors need evidence that can be presented. A jury needs evidence strong enough to establish guilt beyond the required standard. In Susan Place and Georgia Jessup's murders, that process had taken place. In many of the other cases, it never did. The same uncertainty surrounded Lee Bonadies. She had disappeared in 1969, and jewelry associated with her was discovered among Schaefer's possessions. Her remains were eventually found, yet Schaefer was never convicted of her murder. Carmen Hollock's case followed a similar pattern. Investigators discovered material believed to be connected to her, including a tooth identified by her dentist, but Schaefer was never convicted in connection with her disappearance. The cases of Mary Alice Briscolina and Elsie Farmer also remained outside his convictions. Despite the discovery of their remains and the presence of an item associated with Briscolina among possessions linked to Schaefer, Colette Goodenough and Barbara Wilcox disappeared in January 1973 after leaving Biloxi, Mississippi, while attempting to hitchhike back to Florida. Investigators later found Goodenough's passport, diary, and poetry books and Wilcox's driver's license among property associated with Schaefer. Their remains were eventually discovered at Port St. Lucie in 1977, but the cause of death could not be clearly determined. Without that critical information and sufficient evidence connecting Schaefer to the deaths, no murder prosecution followed. These cases show why Schaefer's prison years cannot simply be described as a period in which all his alleged crimes became known. Instead, they were years in which the boundaries of knowledge remained incomplete. Investigators knew more than they had known before the 1973 search. They knew about the belongings. They knew about the violent writings. They knew about the testimony of surviving victims. They knew about the confirmed murders. But they still could not reconstruct every disappearance associated with his name. For the families, that uncertainty was more than a historical problem. It was personal. A murder conviction can provide a family with an official answer. An unresolved disappearance can leave a family caught between possibilities. The discovery of remains may remove the hope that the missing person will return. But if the cause of death cannot be established, the circumstances remain unknown. The appearance of a loved one's possessions in another person's home can create an apparent connection without explaining how or when the object came to be there. And a confession can create hope for an answer, while still leaving investigators unable to establish the facts independently. This was the landscape that surrounded Schaefer for the remainder of his imprisonment. He had already been identified by the legal system as responsible for 2 murders. But there was no equivalent judgment concerning the other names. His death would eventually make that distinction permanent. Before that happened, however, the broader investigation continued to attract attention because of the extraordinary nature of his background. Schaefer had not been an anonymous offender. He had been a deputy sheriff. His position gave him an appearance of authority and legitimacy. The earlier incident involving Nancy Trotter and Pamela Wells had demonstrated how dangerous that authority could become when, according to their testimony, he used it to control them. The girls had survived because he left after receiving a police radio call. Their ability to escape and report what happened became an important part of the investigation that followed. Their survival also meant that there were living witnesses who could describe his alleged behavior. Susan and Georgia had no such opportunity. Their story had to be reconstructed from the evidence left behind. The contrast between these cases remained one of the most disturbing elements of the entire investigation. The same man had been accused of restraining 2 young women, and later 2 other young women disappeared and were found dead. The similarity did not prove every allegation against him, but it helped explain why investigators examined his background so intensely. It also demonstrated why the discovery of the place and Jessup remains had such a profound impact on the investigation. The earlier accusation was no longer an isolated allegation. It became part of a much larger pattern that investigators had to examine carefully. Yet even a pattern has limits. It can guide investigators toward a suspect, but it cannot replace proof. That principle became particularly important as Schaefer's reputation grew. The label killer cop was memorable, but the legal record was narrower. He was a former deputy sheriff convicted of 2 first-degree murders. Everything beyond those convictions required qualification. The distinction did not make the unresolved cases less disturbing. It made them more difficult to explain. A responsible account of Schaefer's life must resist the temptation to convert uncertainty into certainty simply because the larger story appears to fit. There is a profound difference between saying that investigators suspected Schaefer of killing a person and saying that he was proven to have done so. There is also a difference between saying that Schaefer later claimed responsibility and saying that the evidence independently established his responsibility. These distinctions may make the story less sensational, but they make it more accurate. In 1995, after more than 2 decades in prison, the final chapter of Schaefer's life arrived. On December 3rd, Gerard John Schaefer was stabbed to death by another inmate, Vincent Faustino Rivera. Inside a Florida prison, he died while serving the 2 life sentences imposed for the murders of Susan Place and Georgia Jessup. His death meant that he would never again stand before a court to answer for the additional cases associated with his name. Whatever information he possessed about those disappearances died with him. Whatever further claims he might have made could no longer be tested. And whatever evidence might have emerged in the future could no longer lead to a prosecution against him. For Susan and Georgia, the legal story had ended decades earlier. Their killer had been convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. For the other families, the situation was different. Their cases did not receive the same definitive legal conclusion. Some remained unresolved. Some received new attention as technology developed. And some continued to exist as names on lists of people whose lives ended or disappeared under circumstances that were never fully explained. Decades later, advances in DNA technology would provide new opportunities to identify previously unknown remains. One such development occurred in 2022 when the remains of Deborah Poole, a woman who had disappeared in Florida, were identified through DNA and genetic genealogy. Investigators considered whether Schaefer might have been connected to her case because of circumstances surrounding the discovery of her remains that reminded them of his alleged methods. But that possibility remained an investigative consideration, not a proven conclusion that Schaefer had killed her. Even in the modern era, the same rule remained. Identification of a victim is not the same as identification of a killer. The story of Gerard Schaefer therefore ends with a line that can be drawn clearly in one place and only faintly in others. 2 murders were proven in court. Susan Place and Georgia Jessup were victims. Gerard Schaefer was their convicted killer. Beyond those cases lies a long list of names, possessions, remains, statements, and suspicions. Some connections are compelling. Some are disturbing. Some remain impossible to resolve. But they should not be turned into facts simply because they fit the image of the man investigators had come to fear. In the end, the most important lesson of the case may be the importance of remembering those distinctions. True crime is not only about identifying the most frightening possibility. It is about understanding what can actually be established. Susan and Georgia deserve to be remembered not merely as 2 names in the story of a convicted killer, but as 2 teenagers whose lives ended violently and whose families waited for answers. The other missing women and girls deserve the same respect. Their stories should remain separate from speculation unless evidence allows them to be connected. With certainty, Gerard John Schaefer died in prison on December 3, 1995. He took many unanswered questions with him. But the fact that some questions remain unanswered does not erase what is known. 2 young women disappeared together. Their remains were found months later. Investigators followed the evidence to a former deputy sheriff. A jury heard the case. And on September 27, 1973, 1 year after their disappearance, that jury found Gerard John Schaefer guilty of both murders. That is the part of the story that stands beyond speculation. Everything else must be measured against the evidence.